All right, everybody, welcome to the program. It is Saturday, and we're going to review. Really, it's the debate that everybody else is talking about. But so we brought Jeremiah Nortier here to review the debate. Well, not much here. Just working through all kinds of topics. One of them is this debate. I had one chance to see it. And of course, now I brought Jeremiah on for a couple of reasons. Number one, because we're going to review it with the opposing viewpoints of the debate. And I think that in and of itself is interesting. We're going to debate the debate.
You can say, hey, Jeremiah, you're wrong. I'm like, ow, stop it.
I'll say that. That'll happen. But also because Jeremiah was there. He was in person. Actually, and so on that note, for everybody who didn't notice, I got to just
through his son
add this.
And then, of course, the
Oh yeah, I saw you. I didn't see that the first time.
My 5 seconds of fame right there.
Yeah. Now, how was the audio on that, by the way?
It was good on my end. I just asked people. Shane Fisher said fine. Sparky said sounds good. So,
all right, because the debate audio seemed to be quiet, but we'll see how it goes. All right, so now you guys can ask questions. I mentioned that in the thumbnail. As we go through it, send a question at Jeremiah or at me, and I can't say that I'll get every one of them because we are going to be primarily dealing with the debate material, but I'll try to pick them out as we move along to get you guys involved, and we can kind of, we can kind of throw it back and forth a little bit. We can offer some rebuttals here. This isn't any kind of debate. It's not formatted, but a discussion.
Thank goodness. I didn't want a round two with AK like that. Not prepared.
I've been trying to get you on here for quite a while.
Yes, which I do want to say. I felt bad about that. It took me about 2 months to get this new studio. Bam! Got some of that Johnny Mac up there. And then we were going to do a show. I contacted you, had some family issues. And then I had David Lewis on. And you're like, guys, what the heck? I've been trying to connect with y'all, and y'all left me out.
Yeah. Well, yeah, David said he was coming on, but we'll have to get that going. All right, but I appreciate everybody in the audience. Got a good number right here, 14. It's nothing like the apologetic dog audience, but I appreciate every single person.
If you had Dr. White on here instead of me, it would be different.
Well, that's true. That's true. Next time he's on yours, tell him to mosey on over to.
Just so you know, and you know this, I just want everybody else to know, when I talk to Jeffrey Rice and Dr. White about future debate opponents, I'm always trying to throw AK's name in there.
Well, I appreciate that. All right. Well, so, and when you guys ask the questions, we might have some responses to each other, but we're going to keep those brief so we can keep moving along. But we got one already, see? So let's start off. So Adam Carmichael, AK is faith a condition for election? Well, I agree with the Calvinist here that it's absolutely a condition for election.
Yeah, no, this is a good talking point because it kind of depends what you mean. Like faith is a response to the gospel, but unconditional election is kind of pulling back the curtains and saying, like, who is God? What does that eternal counsel look like? What's the exegesis and context of Ephesians chapter 1? And then obviously in John 6, does that support, differing theories? But yeah, that's kind of where it all boils down to.
Yeah. So what I have said is that, let me say Reformed theology. So Reformed theology has unconditional election, but that's not unconditional salvation, because Calvinists and Reformed, some people don't like to be called Calvinists. I just mean it generally. They do believe you have to believe to be saved,
right? But
they believe God chooses who will be. So it's unconditional election. It is not unconditional salvation. I mean, and would you say that represents what you were saying just a second ago?
Yeah. I mean, I think as long as it's qualified that in real time, there has to be a response to the gospel, which is faith apart from works. And the unconditional election really is addressing why some people believe and why some others reject.
Okay, well, let me pull up the debate. I'm starting at the cross-examination. I think that's where the best stuff is. We'll go through as much as we can. So now, Jeremiah, anytime you want to make a point, just say stop, and I'll stop it.
I do have a point I want to make. I really wish I knew who this person was in the chat. An unapologetic cat. Someone's trolling me hard, and I love it.
Unapologetic. Yeah, I saw that. I got no idea. Never heard of them. Okay, now I hope everybody could hear this. The audio was kind of soft, at least on his end. It may not be to everybody else's, and hopefully it's not. All right, so now I do want to set up some background here. Now, if you didn't see the debate, obviously you know from the title, it's a debate on John chapter 6. John chapter 6 is one of the big passages for the issues of typically known as Calvinism, Reformed theology. Obviously, the debate was about whether it contains the idea of unconditional election, which James White affirms and Jeremiah here affirms, which is typically known as a Calvinistic doctrine or a Reformed doctrine. And actually, Jeremiah is of the same, both you and James White are Reformed Baptists, right?
Yes. As we continue to maybe get into this, I've learned so much from Dr. White, and I believe you, because you came and visited 12.5 when he came and spoke. And so he's been very influential in my life. So, yeah, I just encourage people to check out some of his books, even if you disagree. I remember Shane Fisher has messaged me, like, what are some good resources to kind of learn the Reformed Baptist perspective? And Dr. White wrote the book, The God Who Justifies. And so I recommend that book a lot of times to people.
Yeah, now, so James White, believing in unconditional election, believes that God unconditionally before creation, this is the Reformed belief that God before creation unconditionally chose which individuals he would save. Unconditioned means that there's nothing about the person. There is no condition about them that he looks for to choose them. Rather, he chooses for his own mysterious good pleasure about who he will save, and then the rest of the tube, of course. But this is unconditional election. Now, Leighton Flowers, of course, I do hold a very similar, as far as I know, view to him in general. Of course, he's a Baptist too, isn't that right?
Yep.
All right, so he's a Baptist too. Now, we would disagree on a few things, and I don't know a lot about Leighton Flowers' debate. I will say this. Now, just as a little bit of a background, I used to listen in my old job, I used to listen to audio all the time. And for James White, I listened to countless hours for years of James White, not just on Reformed theology, but on a lot of things that I agree with him on. I like James White a lot. When I first started hearing about Leighton Flowers, it was just because of James White talking about him. I eventually did see the Romans 9 debate. I mean, it's been a long time. I wasn't too impressed. Again, that's just from an old memory there. And eventually I did started watching some of his videos because everybody was talking about him when they were talking about James White. But on John chapter 6, now Romans 9, I disagreed with Leighton Flowers on his view on what it means in the passage when it says, for whom he foreknew. I believe Leighton Flowers believes it refers to old Israelites.
Yep.
That's not my view. I don't have the same view, but
can I ask you a question real quick on that?
Yeah.
And you can touch on this as much or little. Are you familiar with the class, like what's classically referred to as the classic Arminian perspective when it comes to foreknowledge? Do you know if you kind of hold to that or if it's nuanced?
Well, so are you talking about the belief that God looks ahead to see who believes or who will believe?
Well, it's that mixed in with God can, in some way, restrain his own sovereignty.
Well, okay. Well, that seems sovereignty is not really the same thing as foreknowledge, though.
Right.
As far as foreknowledge, from what I understand, I mean, that they believe in some cases that God looks ahead in time to see who will believe and then chooses them ahead of time. And something like that.
Yeah, and like in our debate, I'd love to reference people to go check out on your channel or my channel. We kind of got into some of the nuances of libertarian free will and how it necessarily relates back to who God is, and that's kind of going back to Calvinism. Is I can at least speak to my side, AK, of when people are like, "Why Calvinists? Why do you think these proof texts prove Calvinism?" And something that Dr. White said many years ago, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is he says, when you look at the acrostic tulip, the 5 points, he said that necessarily presupposes the S. Now, sovereignty, we all agree with that word, but what does that mean? The Reformed is kind of committed to saying absolute sovereignty includes a divine determinism, sovereign purpose of whatsoever comes to pass. And he's always said that's the bedrock for tulips. So he's always said stulip is really how it should be understood. And I've also tried to explain to people, you got to start with who God is. And then once we understand who God is according to how he's revealed himself, then we just need to be consistent as we study like an anthropology and who man is from there.
Yeah. Okay. Now, well, so just to respond to the foreknowledge thing, that's not my view. I don't believe God looks ahead to learn. I don't believe he learns. I'm definitely not myself omniscient about God's omniscience. There's some difficulties there. But I don't believe he looks ahead to learn. But so you asked about sovereignty, and so my view is God is absolutely sovereign. Now, Calvinists and Reformed theologians, they talk about God's sovereignty, and to me, and not to debate this issue particularly, but you did ask, I believe what they mean when they say sovereign is at least they include the concept that, really, as you mentioned, that he determines everything. I don't believe that's a definition of sovereignty. And the idea of God restraining his sovereignty, well, I wouldn't say that. Gotcha. I would say because he is sovereign, he could choose not to do certain things. If he wants to just allow his creature, man, to make choices that he, God himself, doesn't determine irresistibly in some sense, then he can do that. That's not a restraint of sovereignty. That's a restraint of acts. That's a restraint of doing something, But he's sovereign even when he's doing that, because if he wasn't, he wouldn't have the ability to do that. If he wasn't, he couldn't choose to do that. But the very fact that he could choose to let somebody else choose means he possesses the right to do it. That's my view.
We'll have to go round 2 on that one of these days.
Okay, everybody, you heard it. Round 2 is coming up soon.
Oh yeah. Hey, and
I was going to say though, I forgot about this. Now, not everybody in my audience knows Jeremiah. Probably most do. I mean, it's not like I have a huge audience yet. But for anybody who doesn't know you, I told you I'd give you a opportunity to say whatever you want about yourself.
Make our screens bigger a little bit before we dive into the video. I want people to see that studio. Bam. Hey, Pastor Nathan, who you met at 12.5, he's working on building me a neon logo of the apologetic dog to fit on those back panels. So look forward to that.
That's cool.
Yeah, so my name is Jeremiah Nortier. You can find a lot of my apologetic content you can kind of see the name here, the Apologetic Dog YouTube channel. Look for the bearded dog, and you've arrived at the same place. Please know my heart, even though maybe some of AK's audience and other people tuning in that disagree with me. I don't think that a person has to be reformed in order to be saved. What's at the core of my apologetics ministry, you'll see 1 Timothy 6:20 floating around in the logo on my site and things like that. But Paul tells Timothy, "Oh, Timothy, guard the deposit that's been entrusted to you." And so I think he's talking about the gospel of grace. And it is a gospel of grace that looks to the finished work of Jesus in faith, apart from our works. And so you can look at a lot of my content to see what I mean more by that. So I appreciate you having me on, AK. I know we wanted to do something like this ever since our debate. I know we kind of wanted to talk about our debate from the last summer, but just so much time has passed. But I had fun. That was my second in-person debate, and I think that was your second in-person debate as well.
It was my second. The first one was not ever made public, but yes. Well, actually, I take that back. I suppose it was a third one. I had one when I was really young, and I didn't know what I was doing really, but that didn't make the rounds either.
Now, you don't preach in the pulpit, so you're a very articulate speaker. Now, I say you don't preach. Do you preach?
Yeah, I'm the primary preacher at our congregation.
Awesome. I was not. Where are all your sermons at then?
Well, we don't record them. I mean, it's a small little congregation. I have thought about getting the camera, and I thought about that recently, starting to record some of those.
Gotcha. Yeah,
But,
start
yeah.
recording those bad boys.
Yeah, I'll start doing that. All right. So, so once again, this ought to be interesting for everybody because I just want to emphasize the same two viewpoints that oppose each other as the debate. And what kind of debate? Now, I like to be disciplined about what my objective is in any video or debate. You know, we could go on forever debating some topic or another that we reference as far as our disagreements in these issues, but I tend to do it a little bit and then try to stay focused. You know, some people say, well, why don't you go and talk about that issue more? Well, it's just because I try to stay with the objective. We're reviewing the issues as it pertains to John 6. And to remind you again, you could ask questions throughout the discussion. We might pause and answer those as we did. Just make at Jeremiah or at me, and we'll take a look. All right, Jeremiah, you ready to start listening?
Let's go.
All right. Here we go. This is the cross-examination, and White is up first. I don't know if we'll even get to Flowers, but
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Flowers, is it still true today that no one is able to come to Christ unless they're drawn by the Father?
Hey,
Everyone
I
must
don't
be
see a
drawn in order
video.
to come.
I don't know if everybody else can. I can hear it, but I don't see anything.
you don't see the video. Well, that's weird. I see it.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay. Anybody else not see the video? So I'll wait for. Well, that's weird. Why would they not be able to see it? See, you could see it just fine earlier, right?
Yep, I could. That's weird.
All right, let me remove it and try it again. Strange. See, I haven't used StreamYard in so long.
We gotta get you with that Ecamm Live.
Yeah, is it free? That's why I use
You gotta
StreamYard.
pay to play.
Yeah. Yeah, all right. So I got a tab. How about now?
Yep.
All right, let's try it again.
Come to Christ. The drawing is the teaching. Just like you say in your own book, you actually ask the question, how does God draw them? By teaching them. I agreed with you on that point. He draws by teaching. And so you have to be taught, like Paul said, how will they believe in one whom they've not heard? They have to be taught. There has to be revelation. There has to be light.
Okay, now, Jeremiah, if I may answer the question myself, I also would say that, just as the text says, that no man can come unless drawn. I mean, that's one of the clearer parts of the text. So that would be my answer.
Yeah. And this is where it's so interesting because I love Dr. White, and he understands the Greek language so well. So that's not one of my strong points. So when someone says, what is the drawing? There's a lot of different ways to answer that, and I do think one legit answer is kind of appealing to verse 45, but in verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. So a lot of the question is, what kind of ability, what kind of inability is being talked about here with no one can come, and then the talking about the drawing. So I think verse 45 is kind of indicative of what that drawing looks like. This is where we have to interpret. And so for people, getting mad in the side chat and stuff, is saying like, it doesn't say that. And it's like, well, we're interpreting what that is. And so obviously the Calvinistic perspective is there. It's funny because verse 44 seems like it's hitting on at least 3 points of Calvinism, right? Just on the outside looking in, like I would even go to this verse to say no one. This would kind of assume in some way, and we can kind of draw this out in the context, total depravity, can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. This is kind of an irresistible means that we would appeal to. And then I will raise him up on the last day, mixed in with no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. That also would kind of touch back on unconditional election.
Yeah, so I was going to go into it a little bit more as we move along. My view is pretty similar to Flowers when it comes to John chapter 6. I believe the primary thing he's talking about here is the same thing he's been talking about, which is now that the Son has shown up on the scene in Israel, that God is now shifting the people that were following him, Yahweh, to the person of Jesus Christ. And so the people has been given to him. Now, of course, it's understood about Jesus being divine and pre-existing, but we're talking about him as the Son, who's now has a ministry among Israel. I believe that's what he's talking about. He's drawing. Now, I mean, some of the statements are principles that apply at all times, but I believe this motif in John Jeremiah is that the Israelites that followed God are seeing the Son and following him. And so the drawing, I believe, is, well, I believe it's the learning and hearing from God by having been taught by him by the scriptures and already knowing who he is and learning, you come to the Son. I got a question here. Let's go ahead and put it up. David, he says, is the drawing of John 6:44 the same as the drawing of 12:32? Are you already in the John chapter 12? I see.
Hey,
Usually,
you left John 6. I'm just kidding.
yeah. See, that's okay. No, I believe, and I think if I understood Leighton Flowers, I would agree with him that John chapter 12 is a reference to what is going to happen after the cross. That Jesus' ministry was to the Jews. But I believe that the drawing is the same. Yes, to answer your question, I believe it's the same in the sense that you have to learn through God's revelation. You have to be taught to come to Christ. After the cross, I believe you're taught by primarily the gospel, but that also includes everything in the Old Testament, of course, because, well, we have it. But for the Jews at the time, even though the drawing's the same, it was not through all the revelation we have in the New Testament because they didn't have it. I mean, it was primarily through what they had heard and learned from the Father as the people of God. So that's my answer to that.
So I have a lot more thoughts, but I'll kind of, if you want, I can kind of wait as we progress through the cross-ex and other questions. But I appreciate a lot of what you said, and it's very similar. I would wonder if we would just see this as a divine act or not when we look in verse 45 about hearing and learned. My presuppositions, worldview, and understanding the context is this would be divinely initiated.
Well, I would agree. I think we mean different things by that, of course.
Yeah.
But I would agree with saying that. Now, I guess it needs to be said, the debate is about this. The unconditional election of Reformed theology, is that demonstrated by the text? That's what the debate is all about, of course. But so that's what you're having to look for as an audience in the debate if you're trying to figure out what's going on. Which side is demonstrating their case? Now, really, James White is in the affirmative.
Right.
And so it's his job in the debate. And, when Jeremiah gives his own comments, he speaks for himself. I think that's what he's here to do, is try to demonstrate that he sees it there himself. I don't see unconditional election in there. I see it as conditional. So that's what we're talking about.
Yep.
All right, but we'll comment more as we move along.
I got a lot of Monet on this side to cash in with as we go.
Oh yeah. Let me. I got to bring the screen back. There. All right. Can you see it?
Yep. Looks good on mine.
All right.
And so they have to be drawn by God.
So why is it that no one has the ability to come to Christ? Don't we have free will?
They don't have the ability to believe in one whom they've not been taught about. Just like I said, they have to be drawn by the teaching of God.
So it's a matter of communicating facts or data to someone? Is that what the?
If you want to call the gospel facts and data,
Okay.
I mean, the gospel is the power of God into salvation. It's the light. It's the sword of the Spirit.
I got to say, I know why suppose he wasn't feeling good. I mean, I believe that, but boy, he does not like Leighton Flowers, Jeremiah.
There is a lot of tension built up from 2015 and being there in person. I mean, I basically had popcorn. I'm just watching it back and forth because you heard little snippets from just almost 10 years of tension built up coming out. So it did not disappoint watching these two live.
Yeah. Now think Ossifer says Flowers is simply not as good at debating as White, and I think I can agree with that. Of course, I would agree with the content, of course, with Flowers. But I will say this: in the first portion of the cross-examination, as I went back and listened to it, I think Flowers does very well here. Now, in general, I think he seems to want to debate and focus on topics. I think you can do that as long as you're just saying, where in the text is this, is what you're saying, Todd, But
I think in some ways Leighton did better this go around than 2015. And in some ways, I think he got a little emotional. And I think, people are going to interpret that the way that they want to. But all in all, I think it was a really good correspondence. Dr. White could have addressed a lot of the peripheral things he was bringing up, but chose not to. And this is why I think so, is he's a quote unquote master professor in the Greek language. So for him, that's his wheelhouse instead of kind of addressing everything else. And as people see us engage, you'll see that that's not my wheelhouse. I have to kind of lean back on immediate context, kind of showing points that I see flow together. And you'll see the rings in my understanding of the context of the Gospel of John, New Covenant, fulfillment of the Old Covenant, and then just a holistic worldview altogether.
So now, as far as what they're talking about, Jeremiah, I think I do agree with Flowers here in the things that he's saying. I think White is not getting it when he says, I'm getting a little ahead of myself with some of that, but let me just point out one of his points, Flowers' points here, I agree with, which is that the inability of the text. Okay, there is an inability of the text. Jesus says, no man is able. I mean, that's in the Greek. I mean, it's in the English, but it's in the Greek. We got to say that sometimes to give some emphasis. But there's an inability of the text. We disagree, those on my side and those on your side, as what that inability is. Now White asked, well, don't they have free will? Which assume, because that is Calvinism. Now,
sure,
I know you don't always call yourself a Calvinist. He does, and I'm referring to him.
I'm a Calvinist, baby.
Okay, there you go. But when he says, don't they have free will? I think that demonstrates a presupposition that he's bringing to the text, which is Reformed theology, that this inability affects your ability to make choices. But it's not an inability of the will. It's an inability to come without God's revelation to draw you. So can I give you an example of what I mean?
Yeah, go for it.
Apply it to modern times. There's plenty of people, I mean, it's in the text itself earlier, but to apply it, today's time, there are plenty of religious people that think that they follow Jesus, that I'm sure believe. Let's take all the faith healers. Let's take all the televangelists, Kenneth Copeland. And I don't know if he really thinks that he's a Christian or not. I don't know. I'm sure most of those guys do. But I don't believe that they are. And I'm speaking generally, of course. But they claim to follow Jesus. They take his name. They live their whole life religiously, quoting the Bible. And so I'm sure they do, to some extent, discipline themselves to some things that Jesus says. A lot of things, obviously, they don't. Greed might be one thing they could work on. But the point is this. They haven't come to Christ. They've come to what they think is Christ, but they haven't learned through God's revelation. For example, their heart hasn't been changed, for example, I think many of them, on greed. They're money lovers. They're deceivers. They're proud and vain, So they haven't, it isn't the revelation that they find here of the Spirit hasn't done anything in their heart. I mean, they haven't been transformed by it. And so they haven't really come to Christ. They think they have on their own terms. And so what I'm saying is this. No man can come to Jesus unless drawn. You can't really be a follower of his unless God has actually pulled you in through his revelation, which I think most of that you would even agree with, right?
Yeah, because you got to think this is so loaded with Old Testament truths and history. I mean, even verse 45 is a quotation from, I think it's Isaiah 59. And so, I think about passages in the Old Testament, Psalm 19. Well, it's the law of the Lord that converts the soul. And so, absolutely, in order to be saved, believing, Romans 10 talks about faith comes by that hearing. And I would argue, and this is where, I don't put such a heavy emphasis on the people who are Jewish, because I'm over here saying what we see here has to be consistent even with a Gentile audience. Now there's continuity and discontinuity from Old Testament to New Testament. To me, that's wonderful, beautiful. We see a fulfillment of that. But and I'll just kind of share with you my side for some of the convincing points of, the Calvinistic inability here, because it's really hard. I mean, this is where I wouldn't mind answering a lot of Leighton's objections that he brings to the table, as where Dr. White's going to say, nope, right here. Like, I'm just saying, I'm okay with extending that context. So this does seem to be a type of Jewish audience, right? With the the feast of Passover and what have you. And Jesus is doing all these works of God in their midst, feeding the 5,000 with bread and loaves, wonderful, miraculous works, miracles of God. And so for me, going back earlier in the context is important for kind of understanding kind of this dialogue between this group of people and Jesus. Something I think is remarkable is they're starting to follow Jesus for all the wrong reasons. They're thinking earthly. They're wanting to have their bellies filled up, essentially. And then Jesus in verse 27 says, do not work for the food that perishes. And I just want to pause. They're thinking earthly. This is very reminiscent of Nicodemus, who is thinking in earthly categories, not heavenly transcendent categories. And he says, do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man, Old Testament reference, will give you. For on him God the Father has set his seal. Then they said to him, what must we do to be doing the works of God? Now, this is remarkable, because when I'm interpreting, and what I'm seeing is when they say, what must we do? They're thinking earthly. I think they're saying, what do we need to do to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps to receive these spiritual realities? And then I think Jesus kind of gives this working paradigm for the inability on their part. He said, he answered them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him who he has sent. So I think there Jesus is kind of giving the key of saying it's not something you do. This has to be a miracle, a working of God, which other places in the Old Testament say that he must graciously grant as a gift. But it's something that God has to work at. He's just saying, I'm talking about believing in the Son. And so I think verse 30 onward kind of demonstrates their inability to understand what he's talking about, because they said, what work do you perform? And I'm over here like, guys, he just did all these miracles in front of your eyes. He did the works of God in front of you, your very eyes, and you still do not believe. And I want to throw it back over to you. But since I'm not an expert in the Greek, I have to look to broader context. And so I think in John's account, I know I'm going a few different places. I'd probably be chastised for not staying in John 6. But when we do go back to, I mentioned Nicodemus earlier, and in chapter 3, a couple things here. We get a working anthropology of man. And I know you're just going to be like, Jeremiah, don't say that. And I'm just saying this is what's been meaningful for me just in my exploration of the text and just being prayerful and seeking wisdom. But verse 19 of chapter 3, it says, and this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people love the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works be exposed. It keeps going there, but this is kind of in response to Nicodemus, to which Jesus said, you can't even see the kingdom unless you're born again. And so kind of pushing the context even further back to John chapter 1, 12 and 13, my interpretation. I know you're going to you're going to get me for this. But I think verse 12 that says, you must receive Jesus in faith, believing in his name to have the right to be a child of God. I think verse 13 essentially tells us who those people are. It's those people that it's not a natural will of man, like these gungus movers, these grumbling Jews in John 6. No, this has to be the will of God. You have to be literally born from above. And so my point is, AK, I know I've rambled and preached a little bit here, but this is the type of divine act that I see working with giving the divine revelation. People can hear the gospel. People can be confronted with the law and the prophets, but not everyone believes. And some people even mechanically go through the motions, but the heart has to be engaged. There has to be a work of God in the heart to believe Jesus. So sorry that took so long.
Well, that's all right. Well, let me say this first. As you mentioned there in the beginning, I do believe what Jesus is saying about being drawn applies to everybody, Jew and Gentile. Now, what I was saying is at the time, it just isn't happening for the Gentiles. It comes to the Jew first. That was Jesus' ministry. And there was something unique. And I think this really applies when you're talking about some of the earlier passages, is that the people of God, Israelites who were faithful to God and had been transformed in heart by the scriptures in their lives, would also come to the Son. Those are the people of God being given to the Son. But yes, when Jesus says things like, no man can come to me except drawn, and I will raise him up in the last day, and all those statements, I do believe those will apply to everybody, just not at that time, not to the Gentiles. That's where John chapter 12 comes in. David Lewis had asked about that. So I agree with almost, as far as I remember, most of what you said. So we believe there's an inability of the text. We believe that these people cannot understand the difference. And this is the debate, is why it is. You see, and here's what I'm going to say. For John chapter 6 to establish unconditional election, it has to somewhere tell you that those kinds of things. It has to tell you in some words, I'm not saying verbatim, but somehow it's got to communicate that people cannot make choices to believe the gospel, that it's not up to people. I mean, whatever way you would want to word it. But the focus, remember, is always on verse 44. This is why they're debating that verse, because that's at least White. I don't know about you, but at least White and most Calvinists that I've talked to believe that's at least the most powerful verse. They say, well, there's unconditional election. You can't come to the Son unless God chooses. Well, God is drawing, but it's not an inability of a person based upon, or at least not what the text say. I'll say it like this, Jeremiah. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that unconditional election is taught in the New Testament. So I'm going to say, for the point I'm about to make, you're absolutely right as a theologian. Unconditional election is taught, and someone's going to get a clip of me saying that, and
it's going to be me.
Yeah. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, that it is true. What I'm saying is you couldn't establish it here, because the question is not, can a man come unless drawn? The question is, does God base that drawing on an unconditional election that he made? Well, that's what the text doesn't say. It just says you can't come unless drawn. But remember, we all agree with that. The Flowers was agreeing with that in the text. I mean, in the debate.
Got to chime in a little bit.
Go ahead.
Interesting part in the cross-ex. I don't know if you're going to play it, but White did kind of ask for a standard that would convince Flowers that unconditional election would be true. And the verbiage was, if this drawing is a divine act. And we may have to play it to see exactly what White said, but Flowers said, if that's a divine act, then Calvinism's right, and this teaches unconditional election. So I like to say the burden of proof is saying, hey, is this a divine act? That's compelling to a lot of people if we can establish that, or maybe in your case, what kind of a divine act, right?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure what reference you're making to Flowers, and I'm not saying he didn't say something like that. Not what I would say. I believe it's a divine act. I believe David Lewis, I think, asked this earlier. Do I believe God has to work internally or something? I think you said. Absolutely. And the way all these things that God has done are divine acts. When he sent the Holy Spirit to the church and moved apostles and prophets to preach, when he inspired men to write down the message, and when even by providence, you could call providence, by the way, a divine act, to preach the gospel. I mean, when God is acting, even providential, it doesn't have to be supernaturally, it doesn't have to be miraculous. Anything God is doing is really actually a divine act. I think what is being asked is about an internal supernatural act. Now, I'm just going to tell you, now that is that's the big debate, though. See, I believe the Holy Spirit works in us. I believe he works in us primarily through the gospel. I think there are external influences as well, circumstances of life, all kinds of factors that can influence how you think, and things that, life circumstances that could bring you to your knees and soften the heart. God could do all kinds of things. But as far as an internal work, I believe the primary thing that brings about regeneration, the primary things that brings faith, is the work of the gospel. And we listen to Flowers say, well, it's not just information and data. God's word, the gospel, is powerful. Even human words have a lot of effect on other humans, and it's very much more so, infinitely so, the gospel of God. I think, yes, it works in the heart to create faith. But see, the thing is, I do not believe, as Reformed theology says, that it's this mysterious supernatural work of the Spirit in the heart. I don't know where that is taught. Even if it is, it's not taught in John chapter 6. I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate a lot of what you're saying. A lot of it goes to, I think, holistic worldviews. I think, yes, we do have to exegete the text, but if we're thinking holistically, the whole counsel of God, especially in the immediate context, it's going to color how, because to me, if I see no one can come to me, Jesus says, unless the Father who sent me draws him, I'm over here saying, wow, it's so clear to me that there's an inability that no man can come to this saving knowledge to learn and be heard unless there is some type of divine act. And for me, and I'll just lay my cards out, I don't presuppose a libertarian free will. So my framework is just saying, okay, there is an inability on man until God moves. And when God moves, Jesus is the perfect savior to raise them up on the last day. So the Holy Spirit's assumed here. The Holy Spirit will be mentioned in later chapters of John. For me, what's something that did get brought up in the debate a little bit, AK. So this quotation of, I think it's Isaiah 59 here, when it says, it is written in the prophets, and all will be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Okay. So if this is quoting from Isaiah, I believe this is in the context of the new covenant. So this is where it gets really important for me and kind of overall systematic theology, biblical theology. So we're starting to look in multiple passages in the prophet Isaiah about the new covenant, an eternal covenant, a covenant of peace or shalom that can never fade or pass away. This is so important because God promises in the new covenant that he will write the law, the Torah, on their hearts. And so we would see this as a divine act that God is doing. What's interesting is these are Jewish people here in John chapter 6, and yet they're rejecting. And so I would interpret that they have heard the law and the prophets, but they do not understand. Now, later in John, we need some of these hearing, yet not understanding, seeing, and not actually perceiving, because Jesus has to be lifted up for all men. I'm saying in the new covenant, though, that heart of stone is replaced with the heart of flesh. This is new covenant language. And for me, it's effectual divine acts all over the place. But you can see in my response, I would kind of go elsewhere. Like this quotation out of the prophet Isaiah is very important for my understanding of the new covenant, who is Jew and Gentile. That's why I'm over here saying, yeah, the audience relevance may be the Jews, but the new covenant is made up of believers that God has written his law upon their hearts, taking out that heart of stone, giving a heart of flesh. That's both Jew and Gentile. So I said a lot there. Sorry, AK.
That's all right. You don't have to apologize. You apologize a lot. Hey, listen, I
I make
invite,
people mad. I'm like, oh,
well, I do too. That's the art. That's the art of the word. But okay, well, again, I agree with most of what you said. I just want to say we both believe in an inability. See, that's what the debate is. But what is the basis for the inability? Is it because God has unconditionally chosen certain individuals and not others before the foundation? Now, that's unconditional election. But it doesn't say that in the text. Now, it could be true for the sake of argument. Let's say it's taught in every other passage in the Bible, but it isn't said there. It just says you can't come unless strong, that's the agreed part of the debate. That's what we all agree to. But the unconditional election is the presupposition that drawing, or the reason they can't come, is based upon ultimately an unconditional election of God, and then also the T, and then so forth. Now, those, I argue, Jeremiah, cannot be established from the text. And I want to say again, though, that I also believe these things are divine acts. I just don't assume that, and it is an assumption from the text, not necessarily. I mean, you would say that you've got other texts. But as far as the passage, I don't presuppose that this divine act is irresistible, and I don't believe it's based upon an unconditional election. And that's important for the audience, because I get that a lot. So let me repeat it again. We all agree that salvation is a divine act, and the transformative work of the sinner into a saint is a transformative work of the Spirit. And I believe that no man can come unless drawn. But I do not presuppose from the text, John 6, that it's an irresistible draw and that it's based upon an unconditional election. So I'm just trying to make myself clear.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
What's your understanding earlier in the context when Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent"?
I believe, I've kind of debated that back and forth in my head. I think maybe at least two things that could be. That he could be saying what kind of everybody is saying, that he's trying to say, well, here's the work. If you want to do a work, here's the work, believe. Now, that's why some people will say, well, even faith is a work, therefore. Well, I'm not sure. I think another option, though, is what he's saying is, well, you're asking what works you could do, and you're asking to do the works of God. Let me tell you what God himself has done. If you want to ask about God's work, he's saying, here's what he's done, getting you to believe. That's what he does. That's his work that you need to be focused on. And so I haven't made a decision yet.
Another question, and hopefully people see how, even if they're not convinced, as I'm kind of drawing out the circle of the context, people might be like, okay, I still reject all that Reformed theology stuff, but I can at least see better where they're coming from about what kind of inability is established here in the context. My other question is, verse 45, that's citing Old Testament promises of the new covenant. What is your understanding of when the prophets, or the promise of the new covenant, says that God will write the Torah on their hearts, and then Ezekiel 36 parallel says, I will take out the heart of stone, give them a heart of flesh, and then the next chapter talks about the valley of dry bones. Just kind of, what do you look at? Because to me, that's the divine act that I see taking place.
Okay. Writing the Torah on the heart. I could preach on this all day. I got videos on this, so I got to be brief. Okay. So to have the law in the heart is the difference between having it external to you, written on, in their case, stones, and having it without the need of external control, because it's who you are. So it's like this. It's what the Sermon on the Mount is about. The Sermon on the Mount is the difference between external control, a law out there, outside of you, that says, do this, don't do this, and you got to look at it and say, oh, I got to obey this, I got to do that. Based upon, get rid of that. It's who you are now. It's in your heart. So the law in the heart just simply means you don't need a law to tell you, don't murder your neighbor, don't steal his things, don't commit adultery with his wife. Because the law being on your heart means you don't want to do those things. You love your neighbor because it's now a part of who you are. It's internal control without the need of external restraints of law. So when Jesus says, you've heard that it is said, do not commit adultery, but he that looks upon a woman has committed adultery already. He looks upon a woman to lust after her, that's important, has committed adultery with her already. What he's saying is, okay, it's fine. You scribes and Pharisees are righteous. You haven't committed adultery. But inside you are. So you don't have the law in your heart. You have it outside. It keeps you from externally doing it. But you're no different from the adulterer on the inside. And he wants the law in the heart. So that's what the law in the heart is. It's when Christians, am I being brief? Because I still got more to say. So I might not be brief.
I was going to ask one more clarifying thought. So I think we agree the Imago Dei has the moral law already written on the heart. What's the difference between the moral law already being written on the heart versus something that's being promised in the new covenant of God will write his law on their hearts?
Well, in the old covenant, you could be in the covenant without actually having a heart for God. Children were born into the covenant and they had to be taught to love God, taught to do the things in the law. Yep. You had plenty of unbelieving Jews that were part of the covenant, plenty of wicked people that followed Moses out of the land of promise. So being in the old covenant did not make it certain whether you would have a heart after God, that you would put his law in your heart. In the new covenant, you don't get in until you've already begun that process. You hear the gospel and you have a change of mind towards your sin. That's repentance. Your heart is already starting to change. You put your faith in Christ. Only people in the new covenant are those who have had a change of heart. Now the process goes on. In the old covenant, you could be in it without the change of heart. You can't be in the new covenant without the change of heart.
Yeah. So it sounds like with what you said, I agreed a lot with that. Now I do think, Ezekiel 36 to 37, Jeremiah 31, that's distinctly new covenant language that God is doing. So I'm just saying, I think what we disagreed in there is kind of that relationship between regeneration and faith. So, because I think I hear a lot of what you're saying, I think, oh, I agree, but I'm kind of interpreting what you're saying. And so,
yeah, you have different presuppositions. Yeah. We both say God putting the law of the Spirit on the heart is something the Bible says that he does.
You and I both agree that's some type of divine act, but we're still going to interpret that differently.
Right. I would say that you presuppose it's irresistible and based upon an unconditional election.
And effectual, baby.
Well, that's what I mean by irresistible.
Yeah, I know. Well, hey,
but yeah, so that's the difference. You believe it's effectual, meaning irresistible. Most people don't know what effectual means, but it's an irresistible thing, and it's based upon an unconditional election. Those are not my presuppositions, but we would agree on that. Now, but some of this drawing stuff keeps coming out here in this cross-examination. Let's get back to that. I got to pull it up again. All right, so I have to move my window. Share screen, and here we go. Can you see it?
Yep, looks good.
It pierces in through not only bone and marrow, but into the heart, and it affects our lives. Just like, you may say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words have power.
Okay, so.
Okay, I just want to make a quick comment here because I haven't gotten far again, but I've got the same question before from my Calvinist friends, Jeremiah, and maybe you've thought the same thing. The question that he got is, it's just a matter of hearing data. No, it's a matter of learning and being shaped and internalizing what God's revelation tells you and it changing your heart. Now, even Calvinists, of course, I understand you guys, of course, believe that it has to do the same thing. But again, presuppositions are different. You believe it's for those unconditionally chosen, that will be an effectual, irresistible thing. I believe the person has to let it into their heart. But the John chapter 6 doesn't tell us, which is, I think, the point of the debate. But so it's not a matter of data. And you did mention that all that Israel had heard, and this is, well, I don't want to get ahead. That's actually what they're going to talk about. So unless you want to respond to what I just said, I'm going to keep playing.
Yeah, just in brief. For me, what's compelling is I would say it has to be a work of God. And if the bar is, this is a divine act, and we're not necessarily presupposing a libertarian, incompatibilistic worldview. To me, the inability I see is no man can come to God, learn the truths of salvation that the types and shadows were in the law and prophet. They can't embrace those truths unless the Father draws them to the Son, whom the Son will save indeed and raise them up on the last day. And so I just want to repeat, kind of put that back out there to say, like, that's a compelling reality for me that I see in the text.
Yeah, but I would say though, again though, we're kind of both.
Move on. I thought I was gonna get the last part.
Yeah, well, I guess you're probably right.
Hey, it's
Let
your
me go ahead.
show. You do what you need to do.
Oh, that's all right. Well, we'll have plenty of opportunity.
A person who is drawn, again, looking at verse 44, a person who is drawn by the Father, by the Father to the Son is being taught by God. Is being taught the gospel by God the Father.
Well, Hebrews 1 says, in days of past, God spoke through the prophets and other various means, but in these days, he speaks through his Son, and then, of course, the apostles and the bride. So in that day, in John 6, it's the transitionary period of being taught through the prophets and the law, and now it's transitioning through being taught through Jesus and the bride of Christ through the gospel that's being sent to all of creation.
So everyone who is drawn by the Father to the Son, is that today? Is that all people, or
Now he's asking kind of what we talked about. So I'll answer for myself, and I think really this is what Leighton Flowers meant, is that the drawing, what Jesus says about drawing and all that is always true. It's just happening with Israel only in his ministry, which I think is kind of undebatable. And his position, which I agree, is that after the crucifixion, the gospel goes out and draws the Gentiles as well. The Jews have only had so much time with Jesus at this point, and they were hearing and starting to hear him preach for the first time, since he started his ministry, Jeremiah. But the point is, there were faithful Israelites, and there were unfaithful Israelites already when Jesus came on the scene. The faithful ones were only faithful to God because God had taught them through the prophets and the law, the scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And when they hear Jesus teaching in his ministry, like the people who came to him for food, they hear the teaching. If they had already been faithful to God, if they already had a love for God, they're going to hear truth in Jesus' teaching as well. They may not understand it all. I mean, they probably didn't understand everything in the Old Testament either, but the Son would appeal to them if they had already been appealed to by the Father, and if those who were already been taught and shaped by God through their scriptures would naturally draw to the Son. That's how God is drawing. So I think that's what James White is not understanding about what Flowers is saying.
Get that, James White. Yeah, for me, and you can torch me for saying this. I do think audience relevance here is Jewish, but this is salvation language, believing in the Son. And so this is promised in the new covenant. Like you rightly pointed out, in the old covenant, mixed covenant, covenant of condemnation, ministry of death, ain't gonna save anyone. But the oracles of God promised salvation in the new covenant. That's why now we have some shared principles here. What's being said here in John is also going to be true after John chapter 12, because the new covenant contains both Jew and Gentile. And I believe that can only be made up of believers. So like when we do, I blame Leighton. Leighton brought up the book of Hebrews. Hebrews talks about how the new covenant has a mediator, Christ, who cannot fail to save to the uttermost. Dr. White would say, Pantelos. I love it when he does that. And then my point is the new covenant is made up of believers who have all of their sins forgiven. So point is that would be Jews that were under the old covenant, trusting in the promises of Messiah to come. I would argue they need a divine act in order to believe those types and shadows that are promising the new covenant. So there is some relevance before the cross here, but everything we're learning in terms of anthropology, I would argue would have to be equally as true for Gentiles that come after, essentially, what is it, John 12:32.
But you do understand that I also believe there has to be a divine act for somebody to believe.
Yeah, and we do mean different things by that, and that's why I think a little bit the debate thesis proposition question could have been worded a little bit better, because I just tell people, look, if we're going to debate on a single point of Calvinism, that's a package deal. Like I was already telling you, I see at least 3 points of Calvinism in one verse. And so, and even Dr. White in this, he started talking about an anthropology and total depravity. And so all that's kind of baked in when you're talking about one subject. You do have to kind of talk about more. And so for me, what's really important is verse 45 is a quotation talking about the eternal covenant of peace, which would be the new covenant. That to me is huge in terms of what kind of a divine act is going on. We would differ on this. I would see a mankind. How can I say it that you wouldn't agree? That's in Adam unable to positively respond to God, in an unregenerate state. And therefore, they're like a dead corpse spiritually that God has to bring to newness of life. The Ezekiel 36, 30, 37, Jeremiah 31. So to me, to your point, that's kind of in my mind when I read these texts. And I'm curious, just why it dawned on me to ask you, when you're reading back in John chapter 3 about, like, to me, this is strong total depravity language. When it talks about Jesus had come into the world, and I know John 1 talks about specifically of the Israelites. I think you would agree with me, this would be kind of talking about all of anthropos, all of man, not just the Jewish people that have hardened themselves to the Messiah, but they love the darkness rather than light because their works were evil. And I'm saying, like, to me, that kind of feeds into this. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him.
Yeah. By the way, we got Mick Jagger in the audience. That's pretty interesting.
We got who?
We got Mick Jagger in the audience.
Oh, I don't think I know this person.
Well, he's a singer for the Rolling Stones.
Oh, man, I can't believe he's here.
I know. I didn't know he was interested in this, but well, once again, we can agree on most of what we're saying. It's the presuppositions behind it, which, and I could take the time to go and argue for my presupposition, and then you could. But of course, the question of their debate is,
right?
See, White has to establish the presuppositions. Well, he's got to establish that they're not just presuppositions he's bringing to John 6 for unconditional election. He's got to establish it from the text. I don't think he can. I'm sure you would say that he could, but that is their debate. And I want to emphasize, though, what I'm saying, Jeremiah, about the Jewish thing. Primarily, why that has to be understood is in the earlier verses when Jesus says, "No, all that my Father gives me." Now, in 44 and 45, those are pretty much universal statements. But the context is important when you talk about those earlier verses, because I believe the people that the Father has given to the Son are not those he has unconditionally chosen. I think that's the presupposition. I believe it's in the context of the earlier chapters of John and through the whole book. It's the faithful Israelites that are going to transition to Jesus of Nazareth. And so I don't want to take the time now to go through the other chapters in John to debate that. I'm just saying, so like you and me, for the sake of time, in a debate, Jeremiah, I will always say, if we're debating a passage, the passage in the whole book is legitimate for debating because it's the whole context. And then other references to other books is fine, but you don't then make those the focus. I think sometimes Flowers does that, but anyway. But in our case, only using John 6 because we don't have time to have a debate ourselves, except for in brief here. So just using that one chapter, I would say that this is what White has to be able to do from John chapter 6. That statement earlier in John, because this is one our Calvinist friends use, all that my Father gives me will come to me. The presupposition for Reformed theology is that's those he has unconditionally chosen. Well, even if that's true in other parts of the Bible, now course, I don't
Hear
agree
you
with
loud
that.
and clear. We're just assuming our theology here.
Yeah, even if that were taught in other places in the Bible, it's not found there.
Okay, I'm just doing what I'm determined to do, man, when I read that.
You heard it here, folks. He just conceded.
Someone's going to make that into a clip.
Yeah. And so,
Hey, you think we'll go for another hour or so? Because next clip, I may go get some more coffee.
I'll play the next clip if you want to do that. I'll just say this point. That's what I'm wanting people to keep in mind. And when you do a debate, I got a debate, by the way, I tell you what, go get the coffee. I'm going to plug the upcoming debates.
Plug some of my debates coming up too.
Yeah. We'll see. If I do that, then people are going to watch yours because it's on the same day as mine. I can't have that. But no, actually. So, yeah, so Nortier here has a debate in Jonesboro again. I went up there last year in April, on April 5th. He has a debate on baptism at the 12-5 church, which is where I went to debate him on libertarian free will. So he's got that on April 5th. But I have to say, you guys, make sure you record it because you don't want to watch that because I got a debate on April 5th, although they might not be on the same time. So actually, I got a debate. Now, the reason I brought it up was not just randomly plugging a debate, is because it's a debate on passages. So on April 5th, on a Standing for Truth YouTube channel, I got a debate with Tommy McMurtry, who I believe is a Baptist. Don't quote me on that, but he's not a Calvinist, but he does believe in once saved, always saved. We're debating once saved, always saved. And just like I did with David Lewis, which is a debate you should go see, that debate I had with David Lewis, it's on my channel. We're debating 3 passages each. 3 passages, 4 once saved, always saved from McMurtry, and then I will present 3 that I believe refute it. And I've said all that. I'm plugging my upcoming debate to make this point that I started to make, which is when you do a debate on a passage, don't debate topics. And so this is what I would have pressed White to do. I would have said, okay, now, Dr. White, you have to be able to establish certain things in the chapter itself. If you're going to say that all that the Father gives me will come to me, to argue that establishes unconditional election, you have to show how it does. You have to argue that somehow that means, well, that's those that he's pre-chosen before the foundation of the world unconditionally to be the people of Christ. Well, it doesn't say that. It just says the Father's people will be given to the Son. We all agree on that. You have to establish what is really just a presupposition. You have to establish it from the text. And then the drawing in John 6:44, no man can come to me except the Father draws me. Since we all agree of what it says, the question is the drawing irresistible, and is it based upon an unconditional election? Well, you got to be able to establish that if you're affirming that unconditional election is in the passage, which I don't believe White can. Anyway.
I want to ask the chat, did he say anything about our debates being on the same day and you got to have to see AKs and record mine?
Yeah, I absolutely. They record you because we don't want to miss it. But
something else I was going to say too. This is a little bit of the harder burden, I think, when being the affirmative, because in debate, everyone has to agree with what the Bible says. Okay, so that's where it's good if you know certain verses that are kind of obscure and you know the context real well. Sometimes what I try to do, AK, is I try to ask a question where I'm quoting a verse verbatim. Because if someone says, oh, I disagree with that, well, they've lost that point altogether. You know what I mean? Because you can't disagree with what the Bible says. We're disagreeing on its meaning. And so the harder burden of proof sometimes is the affirmative, because we're having to defend a interpreted phrase, unconditional election, where I think sometimes it's easier, and I'm going to put myself on the spotlight to say this. I think it's easier to say, well, the texts don't say that, and so you're going to have to prove it. And so when the proof is given, sometimes it's easier to say, well, it doesn't say that either. And what I mean is, so like when you and I debated, well, the text doesn't say anywhere libertarian free will. And so I try to guard myself from saying, well, it don't say that. It don't say that. And so like in our debate, you even said, that's kind of a presupposition that you take to the text. And it gets into bigger worldview ideas and things like that. So I think what I'm trying to say is the affirmative has a hard job, and rightly so. And so the negative is trying to cast doubt on what the affirmative is saying. That's the whole point of a debate. And so what I want to echo to people, kind of as we're kind of echoing our sides here, what I think is strong language of a particular kind of divine act that needs to be said. So notice what I'm saying is this is the standard for Leighton Flowers for Calvinism, but for AK, he's being a good philosopher. He's saying what kind of divine act. I like that. Is for me earlier in the context about believing that you believe is a work of God. Now, I would say for a lot of people, that is very compelling evidence of what it means to interpret that God is teaching, being taught by God, and those who have heard and learned. It's not just an assumed, to get into this, an assumed anthropology that says you have a categorical ability to deny or reject. I'm saying if that's not in the forefront of your mind, it seems to me smoother to say, okay, this is talking about a divine act of people under the old covenant that are hearing the promises of the new covenant that are responding in a positive way. They were in a state where they could not respond. They loved darkness, but now they're born again, borrowing language earlier in John. And like AK and I agree, I think the whole book of John is fair game. Now, you do want to ground your main points in the central passage. And so if I'm going to leave John 44, I want to go to verse 45. I want to go to maybe verse 65 in this chapter. I want to go back up to verse 37. All that the Father has given to me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. And then what I'm trying to just remind the audience is what's compelling to me is that the work of God is that you believe. And so believing is a work of God, not of man, which I would argue kind of fits the context. I'm gonna go get my coffee, so don't say mean things about me.
Okay, well, I don't want to debate it. I will say this, though. Well, you can go see Jeremiah and I debate libertarian free will. I believe, because he said that I said that I presuppose libertarian free will. Well, I would say that everybody does until you're taught differently. And I think that's natural and it's default, and it's because I think any other way causes logical problems. Jeremiah disagrees with that, of course, and he's not particularly there at the moment. I didn't want to get into that, but you can go see our debate on that matter. And that's what that issue is. Okay, so while he's still gone, let me just say this. I also got another, it's not a debate, it's a discussion on Marlon's channel, another debate channel called The Gospel Truth in June with Corey Minor from Smart Christian Channel. We're also going to debate Once Saved, Always Saved. Now, those are two different debates, really, because, well, they're not very different, but they're two different versions of Once Saved, Always Saved. Corey Minor holds what is closer to a Calvinist perspective. He claims he's not a Calvinist, which is fine. Tommy McMurtry isn't a Calvinist, so it's a different view. You could fall, you could become a rebel sinner again, be an atheist, and still be saved. He'll speak for himself. Yeah, that's coming on June 21st. Well, the one of Corey Minor, June 21st, April 5th, the one for Tommy McMurtry. All right, but anyway, let's get back into this.
Say nice things.
No. No, I mentioned something about them watching our debate on free will.
You know what? I want your debate or the debate on your channel. I want those to increase in views, and the one on mine. We only have about 1,000. To me, that's a banger. That's one that should go down in the history book.
Yeah. You need to tell people to come watch it on my channel. Okay, let me see here. There we go. Okay, and go.
Is there what differentiates as to who is being drawn by the Father?
Well, we live in the church age, so that the drawing is by Jesus to himself. Jesus draws all people once he's raised up, and he's been raised up. And so he sends the gospel to go into all creation, and through the bride and through the gospel of Jesus Christ, through the teaching of the apostles, we are now being drawn through the teaching of Christ.
So the Father is no longer drawing people to the Son?
Well, there may be people who read the law and the prophets prior. It's people in the Jewish tradition may come to Christ through the teaching.
Okay, I would have answered this differently, and I don't speak for him. I don't even know him. But God draws through revelation, but the way he drew the Jews at the time of the ministry of Christ was primarily through the Old Testament scriptures, because that's most of what they have had. That's what they had grew up. That's what they had already been taught. They were just beginning to hear the ministry of Jesus. I mean, he didn't even have a ministry longer than 3 years. So the drawing is the same. It's just at that time it was unique in the sense that it was those who had already learned from the Old Testament scriptures hearing Jesus speak, and they were attracted to him because he comes from God. If they loved God's word in the Old Testament, they loved it when they heard it from Jesus. Jesus said in chapter 5, Jeremiah, he said, if you believed Moses, you would believe me. Now that's exactly what I think he's talking about. If you believed God through Moses, well, when you hear me, you're going to believe me because I come from the same God. And so I think that's the point. So I would say, if White were to ask me, God draws the same way, just is at that time, it was not through a complete New Testament revelation like they have. So that would be my answer to that.
My answer would be very similar. I don't know if that's a type of dispensational understanding coming out from him, because for me, it's real similar to what you said. The same principle applies Old Testament to New Testament. Justification has always been by grace through faith. And I believe ever since the fall of man, there has been a depravity that really is an inability for man to choose God positively. And so for here, yes, I know there is some relevance to the Jews, but I'm saying not to press that too hard, because even under the Old Covenant in the Torah, the prophets and the writings, you have the promise, the proto-evangelion that has had stacked progressive revelation building on it enough to save Abraham, to save people under the Old Covenant. But I would argue it's always the New Covenant that is salvific, and that New Covenant contains both Jew and Gentile. So that New Covenant is ratified in the blood of Jesus, but saints in the Old Testament, Jew and Gentile, they have their forgiveness of sins on credit from the New Covenant that is about to come. So for me and my systematic theology, pressing the Jewish audience here, to me is, and to use Leighton's own words against him, is almost a distinction without a difference.
In passing, I got to say, by the way, I was assuming that Mick Jagger was not the real name. Now, if it was, he might be insulted, whoever that was. No, and I was just assuming you were using a pseudonym there, so I hope I didn't offend Mick Jagger there if that's his real name. He's probably heard it his whole life if it is.
To chime in real quick, David Lewis is saying, make AK answer some of my questions.
Okay, what's one of his questions here?
Yeah, I was going to say, David's resend those maybe that you want him to answer.
Resend them, because I don't see them here. Okay, so back to what you're saying now. I don't understand what you're pushing back on there. Now, you keep saying, well, I wouldn't press that too much. I don't know if you're responding more to what Flowers was doing or what I'm saying.
No. More towards Leighton. You and I actually are closer in our answer of saying salvation, namely justification, has always been divine revelation. And I'm over here saying that's never changed. Salvation has always been a new covenant idea. Old Testament saints were saved in the revelation of the promised gospel. So type, shadow, substance to come. But justification, salvation has always been the same, whether Jew or Gentile. So to press, in my opinion, Leighton is kind of making a moot point here of just saying, well, this is primarily in focus about the Jews. Well, this is the same problem that Jason Breda, in a previous debate with Dr. White on the limited atonement, essentially, he was trying to say that the golden chain of redemption in Romans 8 is mainly about the Jews. And this is coming from Leighton Flowers. You got to be so careful, because you're about to, I think you've even interacted with hyper dispensationalists that believe in different gospels, old and new.
Yeah.
And so that's some of the entailment, depending on how far you push what Leighton is saying, not you, but what Leighton is saying, because we're over here saying, well, if we go one step further, if this is talking about the Jews, is this a different anthropology than the Gentiles? And then they say, no. We're like, okay, great. Doesn't really matter a whole lot of what's being said.
Now, is Leighton dispensational?
Most Southern Baptists are dispensational. Even old Johnny Mac. I left
Yeah,
the
he's
dispensational
definitely.
world.
Yeah, he's
Give me a
definitely
Johnny Mac.
dispensational. Well, so when I hear Leighton Flowers talking about it, I don't hear him. I hear him saying the same point that God draws in the New Testament just as he did with Jesus. It was just that it happens to be in a ministry that's drawing only Jews. I mean, maybe you know more about Flowers than I do, but
Can I ask you a quick question? Just to kind of
yeah.
because these were thoughts I was having during the debate. So since this is a Jewish audience, do we think they've already heard from the law and the prophets? Like, can we kind of assume that based on this being a Jewish audience?
Ask it again.
So this is a Jewish audience. Is it kind of safe to assume that they've already heard and are familiar with the Torah, and yet they are walking away? We see later in the text.
That is the point. Those Jews that had already heard and learned from God are those who had already been hearing and learning from the scriptures, that had learned to love God and learned about God. And so when they hear Jesus, since he comes from God himself, in fact, we know that he is God, then they're attracted to him. Those Jews earlier and all the ones that later end up leaving him are those that never did learn from the scriptures, which is exactly what Jesus had already said in John 5. If you had believed Moses, you would believe me. The reason the people walk away is because they weren't really faithful to God at all. They never had learned even from their own scriptures. And the answer is right there. Jesus asked the disciples at the end of John chapter 6, do you also want to go? And he said, you have the words of eternal life. See, Peter had already been attracted to Jesus' words. Why? Because he had already heard and learned from God in the first place through the scriptures that they had to learn their whole lives. I didn't see David coming back there. And
yeah, we'll see. Well, this is where I do think our presuppositions kind of color, because when I hear that, I'm saying notice the distinction between the apostles with Judas Iscariot and these gungus-mooing Jews. They are not of God in the sense that they are rejecting his divine revelation. It's the apostles minus Judas Iscariot that have that divine work of believing in their heart, a work of God. Like I said, we understand that we can push the can down the road a little bit further about what that means. But I'm saying, to me, that's the difference in the immediate context of why some are responding and why some are rejecting. And the promise here for unconditional election, also mixed in with perseverance of the saints, is they will be guaranteed to be raised up on the last day.
Right. So in other words, that is the difference between our viewpoints. Is right. You have these Reformed presuppositions about it being an effectual call, which irresistible, and based upon an unconditional election. And the total depravity thing comes in there as a part of the unconditional election and all that.
Something I would like to chime in, and I think you're more consistent with on your view than Leighton Flowers, because he has people, libertarianly, categorically coming to Jesus by means of God's revelation, but he does not believe that they can walk away. And I'm over here saying, to me, that does not make any sense. If you have libertarian,
once saved, always saved is what you mean.
And what I'm saying is, I think your position is being more consistent there, because if you have the libertarian free will to come to the Father, and even though it says unless you're drawn, but if in that drawing really means that your cooperation, people get mad. I'm just saying, just in a way that you have the ability to choose apart from any God's work in eternity past. However we want to splice that out. I'm saying, well, then did you lose that once you come to Christ? Leighton would say maybe not lost it, but no, it's impossible to be lost. And I'm saying he can't make that point consistently unless his anthropology changes and his understanding of God changes. As for you, you would adopt a few of those similar principles. And then I think you would make the consistent point of saying you didn't lose that libertarian free will once you got saved. Therefore, John 6:66, many people left and walked with him no more. They said, we're out.
Yeah. And I would word it a little bit different, but
sure.
Yes.
Trying to be.
And so I've often said, Jeremiah, kind of in reverse. I've said this on my show a number of times. If you're going to believe in once saved, always saved, be a Calvinist and believe it. I always say you shouldn't believe it at all because I don't believe it's true. But if you're going to believe it, the only consistent way to believe it is Calvinistically. And I believe that the Calvinists make sense within their system of once saved, always saved, what they would call perseverance of the saints, what you would call. But other types who are not Calvinists who believe in once saved, always saved, I think that it just doesn't work like it works for the Calvinists. Now, I don't think it works at all, but you know what I'm saying, right?
It hurts. No, and the reason why I don't really like once saved, always saved. Now you got to think Reformed has because usually what's meant by once saved, always saved is you go say that prayer, right? Ask Jesus into your heart, and God's just waiting. He's wooing you with the Spirit, and we're over here saying, man, that's not how we view salvation. We see King Jesus breaking through the stony heart and rescuing a dead soul, bringing him to new life. And I don't even like perseverance of the saints because it seems like you're looking to your own merits and your own efforts to carry yourself to the end. Rather, I think a better term would be preservation of the saints, because I think it's the Holy Spirit carrying us along in spite of ourselves to the end. So anyway, that's why I have a little bit of beef, not with you saying once saved, always saved, but people that are of the Southern Baptist type or provisionist crowd, as Leighton Flowers has kind of coined. So tell me if you knew this about Leighton. And props to Leighton for this. James White, for the past number of years, has been roasting Leighton, saying, quit telling us that you're not Arminians. Quit telling us that you're not Calvinists. Tell us what you are. And so I think Leighton kind of coined the term provisionist, and his acrostic is provide. And it's different than obviously Tulip or the Arminian system. But all of what that means is they reject prevenient grace, and they just believe man's categorical ability not only exists with Adam, but was never lost after the fall. That's something that even classic Arminians would reject. They do believe even the will and choice of man was lost at the fall, but God gives prevenient grace through the proclamation of the gospel.
I don't know enough about the package or the system of provisionism to know whether I could say I'm a provisionist. It's a new term. I probably would never use it anyway. I don't believe in prevenient grace. That's for sure, though. Not an Arminian.
You're a half step closer to the Flower Patch Kids, as I've like to say.
Let me get this back on there. I never did see David there again.
He lost his chance.
All right.
Teachings of God the Father, but it's, as you know, it's a triune God. So God may draw through various means. In the Old Testament, it was as Hebrews 1 says, it was the Father that drew through the prophets.
So actually, verse 44 isn't continuing true today. Something has changed to where when Jesus says, I will raise him up on the last day, who is it that Jesus will raise up on the last day?
Everyone who comes to him in faith.
Everyone who comes to him in faith. And yet in verse 44, who is it that Jesus will raise up on the last day?
Well, in verse 44, like you acknowledge, the difference between the context of chapter 12 and chapter 4 is chapter 4 is still prior to the crucifixion.
I think you mean chapter 6.
I'm sorry, yes, chapter 6, 44. And so in chapter 6, he's drawing those who believe in the Father, who have listened and learned from the Father, he's drawing them to the Son. And they will be raised up in the last day. For example, Simeon would have been a good example of this. He was a God-fearing man. He would have been drawn to believe in Jesus. But after Christ is raised up, that's when he says to go and spread the gospel to all people. And so that's the means by which he draws all people today, is through the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I came through the drawing of Jesus. So we didn't come through the drawing of the prophets.
So everything in John 6 has now changed. Is the eating of the flesh, drinking the blood, has all of that changed now that Jesus is doing the drawing rather?
And this is still the point we've kind of talked about.
Symbolism to listening and learning to the drawing that comes through our God, either through the prophets or through the apostles. Either one is still God doing the drawing. It's just at different means at different times.
Okay.
And so they're still eating the flesh.
So this is we kind of touched on this earlier, but to me, this is where this is a weak point to stress too much with the Jews, because if it's the Jews only, well, then now you have a huge disconnect with the Jewish audience and the Gentiles. And I just want to kind of echo verse 45 is so important, because this, in my view, is indicative of the new covenant, which necessarily includes Gentiles. So as long as, we're not radical dispensationalists saying that, there's two different gospels, the drawing happens by divine revelation. And then I would add, and the effectual work of the Holy Spirit. And so that's kind of the Reformed perspective as we look at verse 44 and 45 together.
Flesh by listening, inclining their ear to hear the gospel, just like when they inclined their ear to hear Moses.
So
if they believed Moses, they would believe Jesus. Sorry.
So did every person who was drawn by the Father?
Okay, now they're getting into some things here that I think are real important. We can really do a lot with.
Okay.
We might even be able to really challenge each other too on this part.
To the Son, come to the Son.
In that context, I have no problem with that interpretation, because he's not drawing them unconditionally. He's drawing them conditioned upon the fact that they listened and learned from the Father.
So the only way for you to understand verse 44 is to have your interpretation of verse 45, right?
Well, obviously we have interpretations of both verses and they correlate together.
Now, White is going to say some things that are pretty mistaken here.
Oh,
But I think the point White is trying to press with his question is like he's backwards, like Flowers is backwards interpreting it. Now, I would disagree that that's what Flowers is doing. And I think anytime that Jesus says something and then says it in a way to make it clear, that's legitimate to say, well, that's obviously what it means. He just clarified it. But I believe that and when Jesus says draw, I think anybody could admit that that statement of itself is quite ambiguous. I mean, Jesus doesn't say anything just within the statement of what drawing is. I mean, if all you knew about the Bible and you read that statement from Jesus, you wouldn't know what in the world the draw was. I mean, it has to be either clarified or you could use further context, which I would say you can get from the previous chapters. But I never liked this idea that, well, if the next statement afterwards explains it, well, that comes after it. So you're backwards interpreting. That's called, that's what the New Testament does, Jeremiah. The New Testament clarifies many obscure prophecies and prefigurements and foreshadows in the Old Testament. It makes it clearer. So future revelation can clear up things in the past anyway.
To add to your point, if I could clear up what I think Dr. White means. Now, he said it first, and I have to say it second to bring clarity. I think what he means, though, is the assumption. This is just my thought. I think what he is accusing Leighton of, and anti-Calvinist, is there's an assumed anthropology in verse 45 that's unargued for all the time, and then that's shoehorned back into verse 44. I think that's the type of pushback he is meaning here, because what you said is absolutely true. In fact, I believe what's necessary for a reformed hermeneutic. Now, we all should be agreeing with the grammatical historical method of interpretation, right? If we're not speaking that language, then if you're not speaking that language, then nothing is intelligible. Like, that's transcendental for human communication. Has to be. What we're doing it right now. But what's also necessary in the reformed paradigm is what's called I'm trying to think of, there's a few different ways to saying it, a Christocentric hermeneutic. Now, you may agree in part with this. Dispensationalists do not agree with this. And so the Reformed, say like this is distinctly Reformed, but maybe they're shared principles. But in order to understand the Old Testament, you have to take Jesus with you into the Old Testament. Like on the road to Emmaus, Jesus said, he expounded on the Hebrew scriptures, the law, the prophets, and the writings. He showed them that it all pointed to him. I believe it's John 5 earlier in the context, or earlier in the book, verse 39. The Jews had twisted the Hebrew scriptures, thinking that they could obtain eternal life, but it was they that testified of Jesus. So kind of the hermeneutic we're saying is Christocentric, redemptive historical hermeneutic, meaning when we go to these less clear passages that are types and shadows in the Old Testament, we're taking the New Testament with us. We're taking Jesus with us. And as Dr. White has said in the past, modern day Jews, they're reading the scriptures with one eye closed. They can't look at Isaiah 53 with its fulfillment. And so anyway, I agree with you in part that in order to understand the old, you have to have clarity from the new. But with Dr. White, I think he's challenging the precepts. You notice it's a presuppositional battle, right? Even though Dr. White's the affirmative, I think it's fair that he challenges maybe, because check this out. Dr. White, do you remember what Dr. Flowers said his ultimate presupposition was? I laughed. I almost wanted to stand up and be like, but he said his presupposition is John 3:16. I'm like, oh my goodness. Yeah, of course. Like you got to be careful on the presuppositions. And I get it. I mean, the negative has to kind of say that to some extent, but we all have presuppositions. And so we rightly can challenge those as we go. But that's what I see a lot happening, AK, is when a meaning is attempting to be drawn out and we use modern vernacular, the other side says it don't say that. And we're like, we know it doesn't say that verbatim, but like you and I are talking about, we're talking about, well, what is the substance carry over into that vernacular?
Yeah. But the significance of this debate is James White has to be able to demonstrate that unconditional election is not presupposed in the text. He has to establish it by the text. That is the debate. Now, he's cross-examining Flowers, so it's fine for him to also challenges his interpretation. But Flowers could at some point say, I may be wrong, but you're not right either. That wouldn't be.
To me, that's the advantage of the negative. They get to cast out, and they're not technically defending anything, even though I actually think everybody's defending something. You just got to be able to know how to shift the burden of proof properly. What else was I going to say? And listening to them reminded me a lot of our debate as well, just talking about presuppositions and so forth.
Yeah, cool. We were debating a topic, which is a whole different ballgame. Now, yes, so when I debated David Lewis, I would often say when dealing with his passages, I would say, I'm not claiming to be able to prove my position from this passage. I said, but are you proving yours?
Were you negative?
Well, when he had his three passages, he had three passages for perseverance of the saints. I had three against them. And then when I would debate his, we were talking about his, like John chapter 10, I would make cases. In Romans 8, I would say, even if your view is taught elsewhere, you must prove it taught here. And I could say it could be, it could fit. I think I even said this to him. I said, your passage, if your view is true, could work with it, but it has to prove it. That's what the debate on a passage is.
Yeah.
Now, and one more point. I just want to make sure everybody knows I'm not saying, well, you don't know what the draw is until verse 44. It's quite clearly stated. But I believe that you can gather it from what has already been said in the previous chapters, that it's those faithful Israelites who had already understood God were being attracted to Jesus. Go ahead.
Yeah, this may be brought up later in the cross-ex, so I won't go super in-depth here. But one of the questions was, from Flowers to Dr. White, is, do you believe that draws here is synonymous with regeneration? I think he was even quoting one of Dr. White's books. And Dr. White just said, hey, that's not the language provided to us, revealed to us, so I want to deal with what John is saying here. And I've often thought, well, even White would agree the drawing here entails regeneration, or the being born again back in John chapter 3. But I've thought, why is the term drag kind of being brought out here? And in Reformed theology, we're saying God's not working against man's will. He's working through man's will. And I think this is, you can respond to it, we can go back to the video, but I think this drawing not only necessarily entails regeneration in the Reformed sense, but it also includes the providence that leads up to that regeneration. Therefore, it's much broader in its scope than just being born again. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. Now, primarily what Jeremiah and I have done in this debate, we haven't really done a lot of debating each other. We've kind of offered opposing viewpoints at times. But because we're trying to just comment on things about the debate. But that's why I just kept saying the debate, here's what I would have done with White. I would have said, all right, Dr. White, do you believe in unconditional election? You believe it's established from John chapter 6? That's what the debate is about. What's that?
You would have said, prove it, buddy.
I would have said, all right, which part of John 6? Pick one, and we'll go to that and we'll do with it. And whatever line he would say, I would say, all right, but how does it prove unconditional election? You know, so if he had said, well, he says, all that the Father gives me will come to me. I say, okay, well, but how do you know that those the Father gives me are unconditionally chosen? Where part of the text says that? And that's why I say that's challenging him to demonstrate those things from the text.
And so Dr. White's a master of doing that from the Greek, because I think he was getting into the verb tenses of saying this is a very specific divine act that necessarily entails the being taught by God or those who are being heard and those who are learning from the Father that will be raised up on the last day. I think he was trying to do that from the Greek. And like I pointed out earlier, I would have to broaden the context back to verse 28 and 29. I think that's that effectual working of God, not of man, that you believe. And so for me, that's really compelling. I did have a question for you, though, because I don't know if you've listened to this on the dividing line. James White mentions the hymns, right? H-I-M in verse 44. I think on Leighton's view, so this might be your view also, or you may nuance it a little bit differently. I think what Dr. White is saying is you can't divorce the hymns here into two different kinds of anthropologies or different ontoses of man. So like this, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Now, he's challenging the provisionist, so we'll see if you would identify with this or what have you. But this is someone who is unbelieving that will believe by the Father's drawing, giving revelation, and then their categorical response, free will. And then he's saying, okay, that's a different kind of him than this in the second sentence. And I will raise him, meaning redeemed person now, up on the last day. White's point is it's got to be the same him, which we would say is the elect, conditionally, effectually drawn. But the burden of proof for even the negative here is to show how you can validate these hymns not being the same.
Let's see if I understand what you're saying is verse 45. No, which one are we in? Oh, verse 44. So no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day.
Who's that first hymn?
No man can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. It's the guy being drawn, whoever that is.
Which is unredeemed.
Well, when you start off being drawn, some people are unredeemed.
Exactly.
Like in the gospel. I mean, like in the gospel age.
Yep.
Now here, it's primarily the faithful Jews that had already heard and learned from the Father.
So if I have my James White hat on, this is where he would be a lot more fierce than me. I just can't do it. But he would say it has to be the same hymn. It has to be the same hymn. You don't get an unbelieving crowd unless it's kind of universalism. This is the unbeliever now also being guaranteed to be raised up on the last day. And he's pushing back on the provisionist, saying you either got two hymns and it doesn't work contextually, or it's the same hymn, which are the elect before the foundation of the world.
Okay, well, I'm not understanding. So when he says, I will draw him, if we admit that the draw is teaching and educating, because it says has heard and learned. If the drawing is drawing through the work of the revelation of God, I mean, that's what my view is, then who he's drawing are those who have heard and learned. Okay, so if that's the first hymn, well, what's the argument?
The argument is it has to be the same hymn.
What do you mean when you say it has to be? What is the it? What do you mean it has to be the same hymn?
Sorry, the hymn has to be the same.
As who?
The one who's redeemed has to be the one that is being drawn by the Father. And so if we have a nebulous group of unredeemed people that are being drawn not effectually, well, then you have a disconnect from whom the Father draws isn't necessarily going to be raised up on the same day. And Dr. White has always made the case is you can't have two different hymns. In this context, it's talking about the same hymn, the one who is unable to come to the Father, who is drawn by divine act, and we have to interpret that. But whoever that first hymn is also the same hymn that will be raised up in salvation on the last day. So this kind of involves the eschaton.
Okay, I guess I'm missing the point. So
that's okay. We can keep moving on. I'm just saying, like, over the years, Dr. White, that's kind of been his major sauce. Right
well,
there.
I don't know, but I'm trying to figure out how that hurts my view. I mean, so
let me ask you, in your view, do you have people that are drawn by the Father that will not be raised up on the last day?
In this context, the drawing is hearing and learning. I mean, so those who hear and learn will be raised. They are the same people. I mean, in the context, the same people. He's not raising up people who haven't heard and learned.
Right. But do you kind of see the point now?
No.
Okay. It's okay, man.
I don't get it. Is this more about once saved, always saved than unconditional election?
Well, unconditional election necessarily entails the P also. So we're saying there's a lot going on in here. But what Dr. White has stressed the point is saying you can't have two different hymns. It has to be the same hymn.
So I'm not getting it, though. I mean, I have the same hymn. He's drawing. The drawing here is...
Here's how we test it. Do you have a hymn that's being drawn by the Father that hypothetically won't be raised up on the last day? Do you have any hymns?
No, there will not be. There will not be someone who has heard and learned who is not raised. And I'm talking about unconditional election. Now, when it comes to once saved, always saved, which is a different topic, I know one is implied by the other, but like I said,
we don't like that term because it kind of means something. Like once saved, always saved typically is the I do have categorical freedom to choose.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying this without
preservation.
Yeah, there you go. Well, and I don't want to necessarily debate this with you, even though I love it. I love the sparks. But I just wanted to tell you kind of what Dr. White has always pressed over the years. And some people might, maybe those who have been eternally decreed, find that compelling to say verse 44 has to be understood before verse 45 without an assumed anthropology that's kind of shoehorned back into verse 44. That's at least what Dr. White is meaning by you can't reverse the order of the text.
Yeah, I've heard this before, but I really don't remember what the thrust of the point is.
Hey, it's a pretty good one. Can we have a half point for that?
Well, what I'm saying is I don't understand it right now. I forgot at least what the point is trying to make. I'm still not quite sure.
Okay.
It kind of reminds me of what this one guy was doing in the free grace movement named Charles Jennings with Timothy when it said, if we die with him, we shall also live with him. And then he would say, well, there you go. It's a condition, it's conditional in the Greek, and it has to be true. So if you had died, no matter what you do, you have to live with him. But what we have to understand is that all that text is saying, and it's the same thing here, is that it doesn't mean there can't be other things implied by other passages. And I'm not quite sure what is being said here.
Okay. So Dr. White's strong point is the first hymn. Who is that? And let's take the provisionist. It's the hymn who's been given revelation, who's being taught by the Father, and the ball is in your court now. Jesus is knocking at the door of your heart, and you have to make that categorical response or not. I would have philosophical objections to that, but we're saying that's the hymn there, okay? We're saying for the sake of argument. And what Jesus is saying is the same hymn is being raised on the last day, those who are redeemed. Now, I know you reject eternal security and so forth, but we're saying
I do believe in eternal security. I reject
Oh, okay.
unconditional
You're,
eternal security.
AK, you are a true philosopher, man. I want to give that to you. Um, but that's what's being meant is you have a first hymn that is being drawn by the Father, which we could just say is the proclamation of the gospel, whether it's in seed form or it's a filled form. But this first hymn doesn't necessarily somebody that will be raised up on the last day. Dr. White's point is, well, that's the second hymn, and the hymns are connected, and you can't have two separate ones like Leighton and the Flower Patch Kids have.
Yeah, well, the person who has heard and learned is not. Remember, it's not just heard. Now, this is what I was wanting to get to. The person who's heard and learned is, at least in this context, the Israelite who has been faithful. I mean, he's not. So that it's not just hearing. And what Dr. White is going to say, and this is what I was going to get to. Dr. White is going to keep saying, at least twice, he's going to say, it says those who have heard will come to the Father. And then Leighton even corrects him and says, no, it's heard and learned. It's not just hearing data. The person who has learned is the person who has been affected by it in such a way as to believe. I mean, and so, yes, that is the person.
Yep, the work of God, right? Earlier in the context. And I think Dr. White is saying the heard and learned are a package
That's
deal
Dr.
here.
Flowers in the side chat.
No way. Is he here?
I mean, isn't that him? Or is that so?
Yes, Dr. Flowers. He heard me say Flower Patch Kids.
No, yeah, I heard you say that before, and I didn't know what.
I'm kind of starstruck right now. I can't believe he's tuned in. I want to say I got to meet Dr. Flowers back in Tullahoma. A gentleman. He even hung out with some of us, during after the conference or in the evenings, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time just getting to meet him. And when I shook hands with Dr. Flowers, I just said, just so you know, my dad really appreciates your content. He's like, so what does that do for the family? I was like, it makes for good discussions when he'll let me talk about the videos of you that he sends me. Okay, so what did he say? Actually, we could concede the hymns can be the same. The distinction is in the condition. Well, yeah, so I appreciate Dr. Flowers saying that. So that's kind of Dr. White's point of saying the condition matters, because you could, on the first hymn, someone could reject the condition of faith and not be raised up on the last day. And I think Dr. Flowers, rebuke me, Dr. Flowers, if I'm misrepresenting, but we're saying that there are two different hymns here, because you can have some people drawn by the Father that reject the condition, however you want to say it, and now they're not being raised up on the same day. We're saying, well, now you have two different hymns.
See, but they're not rejecting the condition. The person who's heard and learned is the person who has been taught. So,
right.
I'm not getting. So, the faithful Israelites, in this case, who had already been, maybe this is the point. Maybe this is the point of what you were saying. It was Flowers was pressing the point. But in this context, the person who has heard and learned, in this case, is the Jew who has heard and learned from the Old Testament scriptures, from the Old Testament revelation. They come to Christ. And the difference is, in the New Testament age, it's the gospel that teaches you. You come through hearing. It's the same thing with Lydia.
Yep.
And in Romans 16 or Acts 16, it says, and the Lord opened her heart. Well, how did he open her heart? Well, she was already a believer in the Old Testament God. Because she had already heard to some degree and learned. So it is the same hymn, because it is the person who has already been attracted to Yahweh through his revelation, and so they hear the Son and they're attracted to him. I mean, do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, this is where we part ways. We agree to disagree. I'm getting better at that over time.
Okay, well, let's keep playing it.
I'm just tickled that Dr. Flowers is in the building.
Yeah, I don't know him. But I agreed with most of what he's saying. And well, I will say this: that I think this part, I think Dr. Flowers does very well here. But what James White is about to do, what James White is about to do, is what I was wanting to get to. Let me go back over here. No, I got to
I
stop
love that.
sharing.
I want to say to Dr. Flowers, really enjoyed the live debate. Loved it.
Sorry about the flickering there.
I would have been disappointed if there wasn't sparks flying in that debate. I'll be honest.
Well, there was primarily from White. It's so testy there.
This is the same view that Michael Brown debated with you. It's the same view that Steve Gregg debated with you.
Michael's not here, so let's stick
And
to
you
the
said
subject.
the same things to
Stick
them
the
that you're saying to
subject,
me.
sir. Sure,
They
stick to the subject.
Well, they corrected you on this, and I'm just wondering why you haven't picked up on it yet.
Well, you should try it because you're not doing so. So those who were drawn in verse 44 are raised up by Jesus, and that's everyone. Everyone who heard from the Father, learned from the Father, is raised up by Jesus in the last day. Is there anyone who rejected the Father's teaching?
I can't imagine why somebody who listened to the Father through the prophets and believed, I can't imagine Simeon saying no to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is one with the Father.
Which is exactly what Jesus said in John chapter 5. He said, if you believed Moses, you would believe me. It wouldn't make any logical sense to say they loved God through his revelation of the Old Testament scriptures, the law and the prophets, but then reject the same revelation coming from Jesus. It's the same God. You can't reject one and love the other. In fact, Jesus says this. This is a theme of John, even in his epistles. He says, if you deny the Son, you deny the Father. He that does not have the Son does not have the Father, because you can't have some of God and then reject other parts of him, and I'm not talking about ontological or Trinity. I'm just talking about revelation. So that is a motif in John, is that those who heard and learned from the Old Testament scriptures, and I think this is, I guess, what I'm missing with your two hymns, but I'm not quite sure. But I think what is being missed by White is that the hearing and the learning is the person, the Jew in this context, who has been taught by God through the Old Testament, not just heard data and information, Jeremiah, but has been shaped by it. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah. Well, we're kind of echoing our thoughts, which is, I think, great. Because what I think is really, if I was in the debate dojo with Dr. Flowers, I would have explored a little bit more of what it means to be in the new covenant, because that necessarily means believers. I'm not Presbyterian, so this is a point that I think really cashes out in this conversation. The new covenant, I would say the Old Testament saints are benefactors, however we want to splice that out. They are benefactors of the new covenant. So salvation has always been the same. Psalm 19 is a good place to say that you need the special revelation of God to convert the soul, because there's an anthropology that matters in this conversation. We're saying there's an inability that Jew cannot come to the Father unless the work of God has been impressed on his heart to believe. And what's interesting about these Gungus mooing Jews is they've seen the work of God in their midst, and they refuse to eat and drink of the Son, namely sing. And then I would argue is just say because they've not been drawn by the Father. They maybe have heard, but without perceiving, because the divine act has not regenerated that heart, which is promised in the new covenant. So we've kind of touched on that, but the hymns do matter, like I said. And like I said, that might be brought out again in this cross.
Well, I'm not saying they don't matter. What I'm saying is...
Sorry. I didn't mean to infer that you're saying it doesn't matter.
What I'm saying is, the point of the debate is for White to establish unconditional election from the text, and saying, and most of what you just said, I can agree with. The point is, but are these things based upon an unconditional election? And that's not what John chapter 6. So that's what I realize.
It don't say it.
It doesn't say it. Everybody heard it. He conceded.
So if somebody listened to your teaching, then they would listen to the teaching of Jeff Durbin, because you teach the same thing. Why would somebody listen and believe your teaching and reject the teaching of Jeff Durbin? You teach the same thing. Same thing. God is teaching something through the prophets and through Moses. There's no reason that he would reject what the Son teaches if they have the same voice. That's why the sheep don't reject him.
But if they have free will, they can choose to do that for various reasons, right?
No, it would be see, he doesn't understand it. It doesn't matter about free will. A person with their free will could choose to reject God in the first place and reject Jesus. But it's a contradiction. It's logically impossible to say that you can love God on one hand in his revelation and then reject him in this other hand. You can't do both. You either accept him in his revelation or you don't, because it's all revelation. So he's not getting Flowers there. He's still hung up on this free will thing. Well, they could just choose not to. No, that would be a contradiction. You understand what I'm saying. You might not agree with it, but you understand the distinction I'm making.
I totally understand. And if Dr. Flowers is still listening, this is where the distinction between you and Leighton really comes out, because there's an anthropology going on here. Now, y'all are on the same island at that point of saying, yep, categorical ability to choose A or not A. God has not made that determination for you. That's all you in the ultimate sense. And so I think what White is bringing out here of saying, so if you're being drawn by the Father, then and you hear and listen, or what's the verbiage here, being taught, heard, and learn, then can you ever choose to leave? You, in some sense, would say yes, and then Leighton would say no. And then we're saying this kind of goes back to, and he'll be raised up at the last day, the eschaton. So it kind of does. This is to your point earlier. There's a lot of topics that can be brought out. And so as much as I appreciate the critique or criticism that can be made of saying, stick to the text. For me personally, I'm not, as well versed in the Greek syntax and the parsing that out. So for me, I have no other choice but to broaden out in the context. So I get why Dr. White is sticking to his wheelhouse, but for me, I see benefit on touching potential peripheral issues that do directly relate to the text. For me, I like it when we're asked about our system and then an entailment over here. How would we account for that data or that information?
Well, let me just say, of course, I'm not anywhere near the expert in Greek that White is, but I read Greek. I'm a student of Greek. The English, for the most part, in this chapter says what the Greek says. I don't believe you can establish it from the Greek any more than you can the English. But anyway.
I'm enjoying this,
But
by
I'm
the way.
saying they would not choose to do so because the Father and the Son are teaching the same thing. There's no reason that a person who's believing what the Father teaches would reject what the Son's teaching if they're teaching the same thing.
When it says they shall all be taught by God, who is the they? Who's the all?
I think that's reference to Israel, just like Romans 10, when he asked, have they not all heard? And he actually says, yes, they have. It's gone to the edges of the earth. And so I think it's the same reference point that, yes, Israel all have heard. Everyone has heard. Not everyone has listened and learned, because that's their responsibility. You can reject what you hear.
So everyone in Israel was taught by God. And so you see it.
He's missing his point. Not everybody in Israel was taught. Everybody has heard, but not everybody learned. The Pharisees, Caiaphas had not learned. Learn in this sense doesn't mean to be educated about facts about the gospel. It means learn in the sense that the gospel affects you in such a way that you believe God and you understand him, and you are, this is what we're talking about. And he mentioned Simeon, which is a good example. The disciples or the apostles, those are the ones learn. Learn in this sense does not mean just come to know facts. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is where I think White does agree that heard and learned are a package deal of salvation, believing. Now, the dispute is how that cashes out in real time, because I'm over here saying, like with Dr. White saying, there's a reason. Oh, you're going to distract me with Dr. Flowers. See, I'm already thrown off by Dr. Flowers being in the chat.
I thought you knew him already.
No, I shook his hand. I was kind of like, oh, I hope he doesn't look up my channel. He's going to be like, oh, he's one of those. But he probably already tell by my beard. And the fact that I had a name tag in Tullahoma's conference of speaker. But
wow.
So
yeah, well, you had that picture with him. That's right. Well, then in one picture you were with White, and the other one you were with Dr. Flowers, and one you were too short, and one you were too tall.
I want to say some of that was the angle. The one gentleman was doing like glamour shots down low, and I'm like, okay. But I think Dr. Flowers, how tall are you? Because he is taller than me. I think he's around maybe 6'3". I'm only 6 foot. And Dr. White is probably around 5'7", 5'8".
Me and White are exactly the same height because we took that picture together, and I'm 5'8". I'm 5'8".
Well, I'm glad you got to meet Dr. White. You were the first questioner at 12.5. Everybody else was scared to death. You got to think I was really nervous about being on stage with him up there.
I held back. I didn't want to press him and come up there swinging. I even made a joke about Steven Anderson. I don't think he took it as a joke, but anyway.
I laughed, and I agree with you. To take repentance out of response to the gospel to me is just kind of nonsense. But I wish you would have asked him about Acts 2:38. That would have been awesome.
No, that's okay. That's all right.
Distinction between that and everyone hearing from the Father, that's a different group.
No, but on the point though, but that was his question. I mean, all of Israel has heard, and I want you to listen. Now, I think you'll concede that he makes a couple mistakes here.
I'm gonna try not to. Though.
No, I believe that all of Israel has heard. Not all of them listened, but all of them heard. Because you're responsible whether you listen to your teacher or not. If you tune out your teacher and ignore what he says, that's your fault, not God's fault.
But it says everyone, everyone hearing from the Father and learning does what?
They come to Jesus.
So if it was all of Israel, why didn't all of Israel come to Jesus?
No, see, Flowers said all of them heard. He didn't say they all heard and believed, and that's the big difference. And White is not. He's not grasping that. Well, they all hear, but they weren't all believers in God. I mean, Caiaphas wasn't, all those, plenty of Jews rejected the Old Testament scriptures. That doesn't mean they weren't religious. Again, I mean, the televangelists are very religious, but that doesn't mean they've actually learned. You know what I'm saying?
So here's my thought on what's going on. I think Dr. White is doing an internal critique on Flowers' view. Because Reformed theology, we would answer this way different because we're over here saying this is the new covenant where all Israel hears and believes. But the question is, who is Israel? We would say, according to Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36 through 37, Romans chapter 2, Romans chapter 9, even Ephesians 2, the mystery of Christ revealed, we're saying Israel are believers, always have been, always will be. They are true Israel. And the quotation from Isaiah 59, we would argue demonstrates that case, that all of Israel hear and believe by a divine act of God. But we're not saying is the ethnic Jew. Now, what's ironic is the ethnic Jews are here hearing and rejecting. And we're saying, they're not of God. They're actually rejecting Moses. Go ahead.
But I don't think Flowers is saying anything different than that. And as far as I know of Dr. Flowers, me and him are in agreement with his view of the remnant of Israel. And John, he's saying that there are plenty of people in the old covenant that are not necessarily believers in God or saved. Yes, they believe in the existence of God and all that, but they haven't actually learned. They're not the faithful remnant. He mentioned Simeon. That's unlike Caiaphas. Caiaphas was in the old covenant. He was a Jew. He was circumcised. He's heard all of his life, but he hadn't learned. Not just simply been educated on facts, but he hadn't learned in the sense of being become a believer truly. Because Jesus said in John 5, if you had believed Moses, you would have believed me.
Good verse.
And so but White had asked the question just now. He said, well, they all heard, so why weren't they all drawn? You see, but
does that make sense?
He's not understanding the learning part.
Well, I think White's trying to demonstrate an internal critique. Not that he's not understanding. He's just trying to step in Leighton's worldview of saying, okay, you got this language of, and to Leighton's credit, I think he gave a decent response, but we would push back and said that response is being read into the text.
But if it's an internal, how can you have an internal critique if you're not interacting with what he's actually, because Flowers is not saying they all heard and learned. They all heard, but didn't all learn. I mean, so I don't know how you can critique something if you're not actually interacting with what he's saying. But anyway.
Well, I think what White's trying to say is it's a package deal. It's a divine act by God. No one can come to me unless the Father sent me, draws him, and raise him up on the last day. And then you have this interesting quote from the Old Covenant or Old Testament scriptures prophesying about the new covenant, to where all of those that hear are all of those who learn, same him, and are those that are be raised up on the last day, being salvific. And then I always point people back to verse 29, this is the work of God that you believe, which
But the passage is talking about hearing and learning. There are people who hear and don't learn.
exactly.
But see, that's, you say exactly, but I think that is the point, is Flowers is talking about hearing and learning, not just the Israelites who heard and didn't learn.
Well, so we're agreement that hearing and learning are a package deal in the verse, right?
But that's what Flowers is saying. But when White says, well, all of Israel has heard, in fact, but listen, here, I think this is going to demonstrate what I'm talking about with White. Listen to what he's going to say here.
Jesus. You're ignoring the fact that you have the ability to listen and believe. If you hear the message, if like everybody in this room just heard me teach, is everybody in this room going to believe what I taught? No, some of them are going to reject what I taught. You're responsible for what you do with what you hear. But just because they hear doesn't mean they'll listen and learn and believe.
But it specifically states, everyone hearing from the Father will come to me.
Okay, now you notice what he just did.
Yes.
What did he just do?
So I think me and you are looking at this a little bit different.
Well, yeah, but just objectively, what did White misquote the text? What did he do?
Oh, so he misquote the text, you say?
He misquoted the text to make the very
Okay.
point that he was making, which is missing what Flowers is doing.
Rewind it.
Rewind it? Okay. Boy, I can't rewind it just a little bit.
Okay. Sorry.
But let me try. See, it's at 120. Let me try to.
I saw Flowers in the chat too, so I was trying to. I'm still a
Maybe
little
I can-
distracted by that, man.
Specifically states, everyone hearing from the Father will come to me. How?
Okay. So you're saying everyone hearing of the Father, the next word is and learn, but White went back up to verse 44 to say will come to me, right?
No, he left out the believe. He said it specifically says everybody hearing will come to me.
Okay.
It's
Okay. So this is where I think that's what Jesus is talking about, is the hearing is the believing, right? Faith comes by hear. Now, we disagree on what the response looks like. Like, we see this as a divine act that is effectual. And I think the other side of the aisle is saying it is a divine act, or Flowers may not. I don't think Flowers sees it as a divine act, AK, because of how one of the last audience questions asked him is, and I'd be curious to see how you answer this. Did you watch the audience Q&A?
I did.
I want to know your thoughts on this, if it's okay. What did you think about that question that said, hey, Leighton Flowers, is conversion, is the responding in faith to the gospel a miracle?
Is it a miracle? What do you mean by miracle?
True philosopher over there. So a divine act that is supernatural, not just providence, but kind of that hand of God intervening in real time, supernatural, not natural occurrences. That's how I would try.
Yeah, well, if by miracle you mean like a changing to our physical nature, no, I don't. Because I don't believe in total depravity and all that.
Oh, man.
But it is a miracle in the sense the gospel was miraculously inspired originally, and I believe providentially God brings it around.
Answer. Okay. So tell me if we can be charitable on this point of kind of agreeing where we part ways. The Calvinist sees conversion as a divine miracle of God, regenerating that dead heart that only loves sin and brings him to newness of life. And we're saying miraculous. It's the most common miracle today, that you have sinners that are dead in their sin and trespasses coming to newness of life. We're saying miraculous hand of God, as where Flowers and you to some degree is saying the miracle is the inspired word by the Holy Spirit, the incarnation that made the gospel possible, but conversion itself is not miraculous. Is that
Well,
fair?
that's why I said earlier, Calvinism, you see, I would agree that conversion and regeneration is a work of the Spirit, and it's a work of the Spirit in the heart. The difference is Calvinists presuppose a mysterious supernatural work of the Spirit that I just don't see the Bible ever saying that. But I get that a lot, Jeremiah, because they say, well, it says he's going to be born of the Spirit. Well, the Spirit has to be doing this. But the disagreement is on what is the Spirit doing. I don't see any kind of mysterious supernatural. And by the way, I don't know if you do, but other Calvinists say it's mysterious. I asked Matt Slick, by the way. Yeah, you mentioned Matt Slick. I asked him. I said, what is the Spirit doing when he regenerates? He said, well, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't tell us that. But that doesn't say anything about the Spirit doing something mysterious. It tells you what the Spirit does. It makes you alive, which all actually happens in God's mind. The sinner being considered alive, now I know there's a change of character and we start to think differently. I mean, I'm not talking about that. But a sinner being considered alive and in union with Christ, adopted as a son, all these things simply happen in God's mind. They don't actually happen ontologically. I mean, the Bible just doesn't talk much about our ontological nature, except for the reforming of the mind, which is a reforming of how you think and your character. Now that's different, but
is that miraculous?
Everything else is not an ontological thing. It's a thing that happens in God's mind. You are a son because he believes you're now a son. He considers you a son. You are now, you now have an inheritance because he says you have an inheritance. You're alive because the relationship is fixed. Anyway, but White's going to say it again here, and then I just want to respond to what he's saying.
Was that not clearly
Everyone who has listened and learned.
And learned.
In other words, they heard and they learned, which implies that they believed. It doesn't say everyone believed. It says everyone has heard the message, and therefore they're responsible for the message they've been given.
But it says every hearing one, pas ha akusas, everyone hearing from the Father comes to me. How?
He did it again. He left out the believing. It doesn't say that. It says and learns. Or I said and believing. It's and learning. Right. And you said, by the way, you said the hearing is the believing. Now, was that a misstatement, or did you mean to say that?
I think in the context, that's what's being taught, is the ones hearing is bringing out faith, and they are responding. The context is all encompassing of Israel doing all of Israel. Now, what I hear you and Flowers saying, well, all within the subset of Israel are responding in this way. And we're saying this is new covenant language where it's from the least to the greatest. It is all encompassing because of who Israel is. It's the believing ones.
Okay, well, first of all, I would say that the hearing is not believing because it's the coming to Jesus is paralleled with believing. He that comes to me has life. He that believes on me has life. Those are parallel. So coming to him is believing, but you don't come until you hear. So the hearing can't be believing. You have to actually hear to believe, but the hearing here is the hearing and learning, which the Old Testament saints who were faithful, because they learned already, saw God in the Son, because they'd already learned from God, so they saw him in the Son, and so they come to Jesus. That's the point.
Yeah, I would agree, and that's what I mean by the hearing is the believing ones. I'm saying it's the ones that are hearing different from those that are hearing and rejecting. All of the hearing ones is all of Israel. But we're talking about the new covenant. We're talking about all believers of all time where they've received this divine work. But like I said, we're kind of touching on a lot of past points. So,
yeah. But I was kind of amazed by that to confirm that White is misunderstanding it. He even misquotes it twice, which shows that he misunderstands it. I mean, it's not even what the text says. Now, of course, White knows what the text says, but he's so focused on what he thinks White is saying that he quotes the text to say something it doesn't say. And it says, now right here, he read this part. He says, pas ha akusas, the one hearing. He says, come to the Father. Well, no, it's also mathon. It's a participle, and it's learning. It's active, by the way. It's learning, being taught. So it's the one. It's not just pas ha akusas. It's pas ha akusas kai mathon. And that's just because he quoted the Greek. The English Jeremiah kind of says the same thing anyway. But I just wanted to make sure people knew that.
You sounded brilliant right there.
Well, no, I mean that's not what I was going for. I'm just saying. White quoted the Greek, but it says mathon. That's there too. That's learning, and that was my point earlier. Is that he's not even getting what White is saying. Okay, so I mean, we could keep playing that, but just let me ask you.
Yeah.
Let me ask you now. What statement in John 6 establishes unconditional election?
I obviously think John 6:44 is an excellent place to start, and I get how the whole debate rages on it. Don't say that, don't say that, and I'm like, I get it, but I do like starting with John 6:44, tag team with verse 37, 65, and I love pressing earlier into the context about believing or believe is a work of God, meaning it's not a work of man. It's not within man. And then I would continue to push early. So I'm sorry, I'm giving a really long-winded answer, but I would start probably with John 6:44, but then connect it to these kind of reaffirming verses that say it is a very particular divine act from God.
Okay. Well,
I would
So-
shotgun this.
no. Okay. So I understand that you're connecting dots, and that's fair to do, but we have to analyze one dot at a time. So verse 44 says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." Now, show me. Do you think that by itself could establish unconditional election?
It depends, because on one hand, no, because once again, we could all agree on what it says, but what does that mean? I think verse 45 is important. Do you hear something? Sounds like snow, like someone's sledding. Do you hear it? Oh, I can't hear you anymore. Fireworks. So I can't hear you. It kind of sounds like fireworks are going off in the background. Okay, it stopped.
Yeah, my battery's running low on this thing. I can re-hook this up though. So let me play this and change my mic.
Okay.
My batteries are dying. That's what it is. Okay. We'll play some more of the debate. Now, when do you want to end, by the way?
I could. It's 9:37 our time.
Now, Flowers says it's the sound of Calvinists being drawn into provision. Are you coming on over, Jeremiah? Well, the provision is my.
Hey, if God determined for that to happen, who am I? Who am I, oh Jeremiah, to answer back to God?
Yeah, that's right. All right, so it's going to die. When it dies is when you're going to hear that sound, but I'm going to change it out here. So when did you say you wanted, how long did you want to go?
Let's see. We've been going for 2 hours 22. I could probably do up till around 10. I've been really enjoying this, so I could go for another 20 minutes.
And by the way, I mean, so Dr. Flowers is in the audience. Dr. Flowers, you're always welcome to come on here and talk about it as
Dang,
well.
You're going to have him on before me. Dadgummit.
But you are on.
No, I'm saying you have him on your channel before I have him on my channel.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he may.
We can't hear.
I said maybe he hasn't got an invite from you is the problem.
That is true. I'll own that one. I got to play my cards close.
All right, I'm going to share it again.
How is that not very clearly the description of what drawing means in verse 44? How can this be a general reference to God teaching Israel?
Everyone who hears from the Father and learns. They all hear his message, but they all don't listen. Some of them close their ears. They close their eyes. Like Acts 28 says, Paul rebuking this same crowd of Israelites saying, you're ever seeing but never perceiving. You have closed your eyes. Otherwise, you might see, hear, understand, and turn, and I would heal you. What's he saying? You have closed your eyes. It's their fault for closing their eyes, not a default condition from birth like you teach.
That spice. Can't hear you. I'm hearing, but not hearing right now.
So you see a distinction in the middle of the sentence. And when it says, it's written in the prophets, they shall all be
Can you hear me
taught
now?
by God. You and
Yeah, but it's a little distorted.
a general thing to all of Israel, right?
Yes.
Okay.
All of Israel has heard. They have
But
no excuse.
then when it's then
Okay, so you can't hear me.
Yep, I can hear you now.
All right. Well, let me say that. No, I forgot my point. He said something there.
Whew, got me out of the hot seat there. Whew.
Let me try to back it up, man. You can back it up too much here.
break, when it says everyone hearing, how is that different than being taught by God? I mean,
Well, you know my answer to that, right?
Yep.
And I because you could hear the gospel, or you could hear, in this case, the Old Testament prophets, and not have been transformed by it, like Caiaphas.
Yep. So my ongoing point there is all those in the new covenant are those who hear divine work has been written on their heart, transformed. They are the ones that learn and are the ones coming to Jesus. So this is important for the new covenant, which will be perfectly mediated by Christ and cannot fail to be raised up on the last day.
But it sounds like you're still talking about those who have heard and learned.
Yep.
And by the way, they're not in the new covenant yet, technically. I mean, he hadn't even.
We would disagree there too. We would say that it's a guarantee that they are in the new covenant by virtue of faith and have received not only justification, but it's on promise. So they are beneficiaries of the new covenant. And some Reformed theologians say that they are members, but it's qualified by promise, faith in that proto-evangelion coming. So they are still in the new covenant, however we want to explain it, because we're saying the new covenant are all the elect of God who are being mediated by a perfect Savior.
Okay, well, so I think this is actually a good verse. What do you think about it?
Okay.
You this verse on the screen.
Ever hearing but not understanding. So, help me out. Is this the quotation from Isaiah 6 applied in the book of Acts in multiple gospel accounts?
I believe so. It's the only one I'm aware of.
Okay. So I think this is talking about judicial hardening and is very specific, not only for the foreshadowing. Well, back in Isaiah, it was happening in real time. God was judging unrepentant ethnic Israel who were unbelieving. And in the gospel times, it's happening again in real time, kind of as its fulfillment. So it's very prophetic. So I want to say here, this is not talking about the elect, which I would say is talking in the new covenant in Isaiah 45. That is talking about ethnic Jews that are hearing the revelation of God, but they have hearts of stone.
So you seem to concede that you can hear and not learn.
Not true Israel.
But the text doesn't distinguish. I mean,
we would disagree, because I would say the quotation from Isaiah 59 makes that case for me, which is
but I think this works for the point. If you're going to say that hearing and learning in John 6 is about spiritual Israel, well, that would mean that those that have heard and haven't learned are a different class of people, right? I mean, it's not. Well, I think what Leighton Flowers is talking about is the same thing I understand. It's those who hear and respond to what is being said, particularly the Jews here in the Old Testament prophets. But it does distinguish that there is hearing and not learning in some cases.
So my pushback is saying here, this is a package deal, and all Israel, ? Respond in this way. And we're saying all Israel are believers of all time. They're the elect. And so that's what we're saying is all these verses are talking about. And White's internal critique is saying, Well, now, and I get how it comes out in the conversation, but White's saying all Israel is being mentioned here, right? Essentially, and they will all be taught by God. And so he's trying to push back on saying who is the all. And I get Flowers' pushback as saying if we're talking about all of ethnic Israel, some are going to hear and not learn, because I think White understands this point too. But he's trying to push back and say, no, this is all a package deal from verse 44 into 45, because these ones that are hearing are also the ones learning. And these are the ones that will be raised up salvifically on the last day because they responded in faith. The interesting point, though, is that it's all of them. And we're over here saying that makes sense in the new covenant, but kind of on the other side, you got the separations of the hymns.
Well, there's a lot of things there that I disagree with that are a different discussion. I don't believe they're in the new covenant yet because you still got the old covenant. You still got it there. And but anyway, that doesn't matter. Well, so you're saying, well, we believe it's people in the new covenant, spiritual Israel. Of course, I'm an amillennialist, but I don't.
Me too.
The John chapter 6 is just talking. All he says in John 6 is, no man can come to me except the Father who sent me draws him. And then it says, as he goes on, he says, all who have heard and learned from the Father. Now, he may be pressing Leighton there. Of course, he's being cross-examined. That's fine. But the point I'm trying to really emphasize is that the burden of proof really is on White to establish unconditional election. And you can't get that from those things. Especially, you could say, well, you, Jeremiah, believe it's about spiritual Israel and all that, and it's not about the hearing that unbelieving Israel would have. But, see, that's the thing is, all Leighton really has to do is say, well, you could be true, but you can't establish that I'm wrong from the text. And then that's the point. You've demonstrated, as long as Flowers can demonstrate there's a legitimate way to interpret the text itself, then White has lost, because he can't prove his position from the text. Even if it was true, another text, Jeremiah, if this passage debated allows for an alternative viewpoint, you've lost the debate if you're right.
Darn it.
I know it, right?
Yeah, no, and I agree in principle of what has to be done. And it's funny because I do think people that are already reformed think that Dr. White knocked out of the park. I think that people that are hardened against Reformed theology don't see it. Maybe they don't have ears to hear. And I think people in the middle have a really good opportunity to weigh those two out. You know what I mean? So I'm with you in principle.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Now, Jeremiah, when I try to give some of my comments on it, I try to just be objective. I try to give pros and cons for both. I didn't just come out and say, oh, man, why? Because I saw people in the side chat at the end, they said, oh, Flowers is done after this. I said, come on, do you not see? I mean, I don't say, White is done. Now, I don't ever say that when I'm watching a debate. Someone I disagree with, I don't say they're done. I mean, because that's not really the way that works. It just doesn't work that way. And I think you're right. That's why I try to be objective. But while we're doing the review, Jeremiah, I'm not trying to be just simply repetitive for no good reason. I'm trying to say, because you and I could get into these points and we could debate it and spend all the time. We have a debate that we could point people to. But I just want to say, for the purpose of the debate, when Flowers, you're correct, the negative is at an advantage. It's up to White to prove that unconditional election is not a presupposition. It is in the text. And I'm saying you can't get that now. Well, that brings me back to you, though, because you said verse 44 connected with the other ones. But I can agree. Do you not realize that I can agree with everything in verse 44? If I can agree to it, that means your presupposition of unconditional election can't be found there. So I just want to be clear. Now, you obviously would disagree.
Yeah.
How can you?
Wait, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, how can you establish anything in 44 as being that the drawing is based upon an unconditional election? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think what we can get out of John 6:44 is a kind of inability, and we follow it. No one can come to me, Jesus, salvifically, That's the context. Unless there is a type of divine act. Now, you and I will agree with that. Leighton in his debate kind of conceded that if it's a divine act, but now in the side chat, he just said basically the eye and tulip is what he means. And I get it. But I'm saying there's a very specific divine act that's done by the Father in the drawing, which I think is providence plus regeneration. And I would continue to parse that out and defend that. And the same draws him, same him. God says, I will raise him up on the last day. So I would repeat a lot of things that we said into verse 45. I think
But-
you would say it doesn't say that. And I'm saying,
Well, how do you, if I can agree with all that, it's a divine act, but how can you prove it's based upon an unconditional election?
yeah, so, well, we'd have to define what unconditional election means, right?
There's no condition in man that God looks to choose to save him.
Right. And so,
How can you establish that from here, though?
yeah. So verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. We would draw out of that meaning. This is pointing to not only unconditional election, but total depravity, irresistible grace. And then I would say because of the eschaton, this is also eternal security. So I would begin to unpack it. I think you would just say, don't say that. We agree with what it says. And I understand. But
Well, I don't mean it doesn't say it verbatim. I never take the position the text has to say something verbatim. I mean, in order for verse 44 to establish unconditional election, it does have to say something that necessarily implies it. So, but is it not possible, if you don't know nothing else in the rest of the New Testament, if it says no man can come to me except the Father draws him, is it possible to draw him in some other? Can God draw somebody that's based upon a conditional election? If God, not that God does, I know you disagree with that, but could somebody also say, well, nobody can come to him unless God draws him, and he draws him based upon a conditional election? Now, you say, well, I don't believe that. That's fine. But how can you disprove that from the text itself?
yeah, I mean, I think we're going to be on repeat. I'm just being honest, because I think looking at this verse alone, most people historically have been very bothered by it. I mean, I'm just saying, like, the text itself has produced this very conversation.
I love it.
Say
I
again?
love the text. I'm not bothered by it, but I know what
Yeah,
you're saying.
Well, I'm just saying that when you ask, is it possible? I'm saying, oh yeah, like you and I are proof that someone like me can read that and think, dang, divine act brought me out of, my deadness of sin, not seeking God. And yes, I responded by learning in faith, but I'm over here saying that could not have happened unless the Father dragged me out of that previous state. So I'm just saying, and then you would push back and say, don't say that. And then kind of,
Yes, all that is presuppositional. Just like you said, it's an inability. I agree that it's an inability, but it could be whatever inability it is. It doesn't mean it's still based upon an unconditional election. I don't believe in prevenient grace, but we could say, well, that might be the inability. I don't believe it is. I'm just saying for the sake of discussion, let's say, well, there's an inability and God gives prevenient grace according to some. I could say, well, that's at least a logical possibility. I can't establish that from the text. I don't believe it's established anywhere. But the point is, you have to be able to show the basis of this, because all it says is that no one can come unless drawn. I mean, but that doesn't prove he only draws those based upon an unconditional election. What's the other verse? You mentioned what?
Real quick, we can talk about the other verses that all kind of relate back to everything we've been talking about. I did ask Leighton Flowers about verse 29. I was very curious because to me, verse 29 is one of those really important verses in the flow of this context. If you go back earlier in the chat, I thought you'd be interested to see this. Dr. Flowers says, verse 29, I think I agree with John's Calvin commentary on this verse, ironically. I didn't know if you want to put that up there.
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying to get another screen in there, but yeah.
Say it again, Dr. Flowers.
He said what?
So I asked him in the side chat what his understanding of verse 29 is, because I think because I thought he would disagree with you on this verse. And yeah. So this is huge for me, that believing. Now he's gonna disagree. I think he probably disagrees with Calvin. But what this verse is telling me is belief, whatever the Greek is. I can't read it. That's a work of God. Now, Dr. Flowers, I hope he doesn't get mad at me. I want him to like me. But he had in his closing statement years ago, he just said, since we're made in the imago Dei, just as God can speak the universe ex nihilo from nothing, us being made in the imago Dei, we too can bring our faith from nothing. And that has troubled me ever since I've listened to that, just because since we're the imago Dei, we reflect the image of God. We're not on that same playing field, which gets back into our debate last time. So anyway, I look at this kind of just on the surface saying, man, that is meaningful to me to say that God, the ones believing, responding, hearing, learning, believing, taking in the Son, that's a work of God. And
I would say, I don't know what he would say. I don't believe ex nihilo in the sense of from nothing. At least you come from the gospel. I mean, your belief comes from the gospel. It's something God has done. You respond in faith because of what God is doing.
Okay. Real quick. He said, if you want to put it up here, he goes, I didn't say bring faith from nothing. I just want people to know I'm not trying to misrepresent Dr. Flowers, but I remember him saying something to that effect. And so anyway,
I don't see it.
It's one of his.
Oh, right here. I see.
Yeah. So Dr. Flowers, if you remember what you said, I'd like to just see it, because that's what I remember you said. I thought you were making the fact that we're made in the imago Dei, we too can bring our faith from nothing. So if I'm wrong there, I want to see it. I compared the mystery of creating something from nothing with, So to me that sounds like a distinction without a difference. I always wanted to say that, kind of directed at Leighton Flowers. But anyway.
But I mean, that's what the Bible says. Faith that comes by hearing the word of God. I mean, that's what that says. But well, we can't play the whole debate. Obviously, nobody ever does. In fact, I think people do what we do. You play a little bit, and you spend most of the time just talking about it. Which, what else are you going to do? But that's ultimately what Flowers was doing in the cross-examination when he was cross-examining White, and that's what it comes down to: is Dr. White, can you establish that unconditional election is not what you're presupposing? And I had asked you, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I mean, but
I'll try to love you again.
I think we don't have to go over and over, but I think I'll leave it for the audience to see whether you can establish unconditional election by verse 44. And I don't think it says anything about the basis of the drawing. It just simply does it. It doesn't mention why he draws, who he draws, or who he chose to draw. It doesn't mention the basis, Jeremiah, but you made your case. What was the other verse?
37, 44, 65 is always kind of the chain that you.
Oh, by the way, you did ask in 29 something about the Greek and works. Well, it says ergon to theou, that's work of God. I mean, you were asking about that.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't have it on the screen. I'm sorry.
Very good. Well, I interact with people that say, see, your ability to believe categorically is a work, but it's something you do, not God. And I'm over here scratching my head saying explicitly it's a work of God. Like, I think that's the divine work that Jesus is talking about and continuing later in the context. And I get how not everybody's convinced by that. Maybe you have to be eternally decreed to believe that. I don't know.
Okay, what was the other verse? The one up here in the chapter.
Yeah, so 29 is super important for me. I was going to also say there have been works of God earlier in John 6, but it's verse 11. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. That is a miracle work of God. And I'm saying this is the same context of saying belief has to be a miracle of God in your heart. That's why verse 44 and 45, well, 37, with the Gungus mooing people, Jews, 44 and 45 is so important because this is the new covenant that God has written the Torah on their hearts, something that the Holy Spirit has regenerated, has taken out that heart of stone, given them a heart of flesh, and causes them to walk in his statutes. So for me, I see that all being drawn out from the text. This quotation is of the new covenant, the covenant of peace, an everlasting covenant. This is the covenant of grace that's found in Jesus's wrought blood. Hebrews goes.
Well, I have some differences with you there. I mean, I believe Christ brought the new covenant, but the old covenant is still there technically. But nevertheless, it really doesn't hurt my position because the principle is the same. And the new covenant you hear by the gospel being taught, coupled most of the time with the Old Testament revelation too. But for anybody that doesn't know it, because you mentioned it several times, gungus moving is just a Greek word for grumbling. Actually, it's gonguso here anyway.
I wanted to say it because Dr. Flowers said it in his opening and rebuttal, because Dr. White has said that for years. He loves saying gungus mooing. So I appreciate that in the debate.
Okay, but back to verse 29. This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. Now, how do you establish unconditional election from that?
Yeah, where does belief come from?
Well, but you have to, but you would have to establish that it came based upon unconditional election.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that when we're looking at the context, man does not have the ability in and of himself to believe unless a divine miracle occurs in the heart to believe. And I think that's clear. I think that's literally like what you're asking for is drawing it out. And I'm saying that's why this flows well. You have those that already saw the works of God in their midst, and they said, we care more about the earthly things, right? We want the miracles for our benefit. And so
if I grant you everything, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, that's fine.
If I grant you everything you just said, but how do you know it's based upon? And so God has to work a miracle in their heart. He has to give belief. But how do you know he bases who he does that to on an unconditional election? Why can't it be on a conditional election?
Well, if you grant to me my Calvinistic understanding of verse 29, then it's clear where unconditional election comes out in verse 44, because God particularly is drawing those that will effectually come to saving faith in King Jesus and will be raised up on the last day. So really, for the sake of debate, you couldn't grant me that understanding of verse 29.
No, I was granting to you the things you said about God has to work a miracle. He gives you faith. What I don't grant to you is the very thing you need for it to say that it's based upon an unconditional election. That's my point.
Well, my point is if you grant the Calvinistic understanding of verse 29, then it's easy to understand verse 44 and 45 with the new covenant.
Okay, well, I did go to 44 though, and then I'm looking at verse 29. I wasn't granting to you the presupposition of unconditional election. I'm trying to, because you mentioned this verse, and I want you to be able to. What I'm doing, Jeremiah, is I'm trying to do what I would have done with White if I had debated him, and I appreciate you trying to get that debate. By the way,
hey, I got your back, man.
I appreciate it, but keep working on him. You keep having him on your program and say, "Hey, this A.K. Richardson, he's not."
Believe it or not, me and him, we actually have like good email correspondence and whatnot. So did you listen to my interview of Dr. White?
I didn't.
Okay, you need to do that, by the way. But I got to explain my favorite story because we did a whole debate tour review. So we covered all 5 debates that he did. And I got to tell you this real quick. So to me, I didn't realize Dr. White and I were as close as we are. But at the Jason Breda debate, which, by the way, did you watch that debate?
No, I didn't.
Okay. It's like you have a full-time job or something and a family. So during that debate, and Leighton's maybe heard me say this before. I just gotta retell this. So James Bott went first because he's defending limited atonement essentially, And so, he kind of speaks to Romans 8, Hebrews 7, Trinitarian harmony. Voila. It's not his first rodeo. He did a good job. And then Jason Breda comes up and he says something almost heretical. And he basically brings out the golden chain in Romans 8 and says, this is talking about the Jews. It's not even in Paul's purview to even talk about Gentiles. And we're over here like, and then Dr. White comes out in his rebuttal basically saying, what you heard is either a rank heresy or he needs to soften his stance and say, yeah, but that's still true of the Gentiles. So that's what Jason Breda did. We're all like, whoo, out in the crowd. So this is where the memorable moment comes in. Because Keith Foskey, he was moderating the debate and did an excellent job. He's like, all right, everybody, you got a break for 15 minutes, intermission. Don't harass the debaters, but be back in 15 minutes. And so I'm chilling in the back with some of the crew from 12.5 and other people that I met there talking with. And so Dr. White comes to the front of the stage and he points at me, AK, and says, come here, Jeremiah. And I'm like, me? So I kind of, everybody's looking at me. They just kind of part ways, I'm just kind of straight down there. And so he had to check his sanity with me, AK. He said, am I hearing what's being said properly? And I kind of put my hand on his shoulder. I said, Dr. White, I said, we're hearing the same thing you're hearing up there. And he said, I've never heard this argument. And you know what I did? I want Dr. Flowers to hear this. I was like, oh, I put on my shoulder. I was like, I know where he's getting this from. And what I meant is I've heard, I think Dr. Flowers had David Paulman, classical Arminian, on to talk about kind of the exegesis understanding of Romans 8. And the classical Arminian understanding is kind of the simple foreknowledge view, those whom he foreknew, and that helps cash out the rest of the golden chain. And I think Dr. Flowers said something to the effect of, no, this is talking about the patriarchs of old. And I remember just thinking, I've never heard of such a thing. So anyway, that's the point that Jason Breda was making. And so I told Dr. White, I was like, oh yeah, that's coming from Dr. Flowers. Maybe. And I don't know. I'm sure they talked behind the scenes. But here's what I was wanting to tell you. He said, you're kidding me. And I said something to the effect of Dr. White. I said, look, this Jason guy, props to his boldness, definitely came into the Calvinist line then to debate you on limited atonement. I said, but I don't appreciate how much confusion he's brought. And I said, I really hope you expose everything for what it's worth. And he says, oh, it's not going to be pretty. And so my point is, I was really trying to rev that engine to get him ready for the cross-examination. And if you go watch it, it was definitely one-sided in my most humble, unbiased opinion.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, and I might go watch that. Okay. Well, just closing up some of the things we were talking about here. So in verse 29, when it says, this is the work of God that you believe in him whom he has sent. The basis for, of course, my view. I don't believe I believe God causes belief, but he doesn't do it irresistibly. And it's not based upon an unconditional election. I believe he does it.
You have different presuppositions?
I have different presuppositions. But if I can bring different presuppositions and the verse say the same thing and be logical, then it means your presupposition is a presupposition also, which is unconditional election for the verse. And if it is, then it isn't a proof text for your verse. See, that's what the debate is about. When I debated David Lewis, I'm a repetitive person, Jeremiah, but I want people to know this. The burden of proof was on White. You have to prove it from the text. You can't just whatever White Flowers believes. Just like in my debate with Lewis, even if I was wrong on my interpretations of Romans 8 or whatever it was we were debating from his passages, I could still be wrong, but he has to prove that he's right. And I said, the text doesn't say what you need it to say. Even if John 6 works with unconditional election, let's say it's definitely true. Let's say the book of, the fifth gospel was in there, the gospel of whatever, Bojangles, and it taught unconditional election in the clearest of terms. Okay, well, we say, John 6, I can work that for the most part with unconditional election, but you can't prove it, Jeremiah, and that White loses the debate. And why is that important to me as a non-Calvinist? Because John 6 is always touted as a Calvinistic proof text, and I'm saying it might fit for the most part with it, but it doesn't establish it. You know what I'm saying?
It just hasn't been determined for you to see it.
And yet I get the blame. What a
You do.
shame.
Truly and morally so, but that's a different conversation.
That's a different debate, and that's the debate you and I had.
I really enjoyed that debate because I got to finally address your how did you say it? I loved it because I listened to so much of your content in preparation for our debate. And so what did you always say? Ask the Calvinists. Well, who determined that? Well, who determined that? Who determined that? And to me, the only way to engage you on that level is you have to have the compatibilistic framework to make heads or tails. And so I
Well, you know why I say that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of times you guys will cite a thing, but you don't follow it to the logical conclusion. Now, I call that, that's something silly, ignoring the shooter. You focus on, this guy died from a bullet. It says right there, the bullet killed him, end of case. And it's like, but somebody shot the bullet. And you guys will say, well, the bullet is what killed him. It entered the body, pierced the liver. This is why he died. But you're ignoring that the bullet was shot. And that's why I always say, just like somebody said in the side chat, does AK believe he has to allow God to regenerate him? And you guys used the word allow. You used it in the debate, but then that's why the question comes. Yes, that's why the question is, but what is he allowing? But the very things he determines. And when you guys say, well, no, the sinner is choosing. He's choosing. He's responsible because he's choosing his sins. And I say, but God determined for him to choose the sin.
Who determined that?
Exactly. Now, I got to take bone with that too, or I got a bone to pick with that. You guys always say, well, I don't know about you, but Calvinists always say, well, the sinner is free to choose his sin. But that's not true, because even in Calvinism, the sinner can't even choose which sin. He chooses only what God determined which sin. So he's not even free to choose the particular sins he would like to commit. He's not even free to like them. Anyway, I'm having fun with you here, but
it hurts. I enjoyed it. I really think me and you advanced the conversation because, I brought out the philosophical distinctions between categorical and conditional. And yes, I'm glad he brought that up, because in Reformed theology, we also talk about moral ability and natural ability. Remember how that was something that you thought that's what I was talking about? That's meaningful for federal headship, but I was talking about the two categories that's important for compatibilism. So we were talking past each other, and we have to always define terms. I tried so hard to do that in the opening statement, but it's hard for you hearing stuff for the first time to get a proper definition. That's where one of my favorite video clips I got to make was you. I asked you a question, and it was giving you fits, which it's a philosophical thing about, if we're given libertarian free will, but we're necessarily going to sin, what does that mean for libertarian free will? That has a whole history with it. And then my other fun part of the debate, and to me, these aren't gotcha. And to me, I would never want to declare victory in a debate. I've told people I felt like me and you were evenly matched, and that's what makes a good debate. Now, maybe your crowd says, no, AK wiped the floor with him. I'm like, he did, and it hurt. Like, I'm still recovering. Like, to me, I just don't even try to, like, even with Dr. White and Flowers, it was, in my opinion, a good debate. But what I mean is I showed up for entertainment. Dr. Flowers did the Dr. Flowers thing, and Dr. White did the Dr. White thing.
He did the White, but he was he wasn't never good. I mean, when he debates Muslims, he's very nice and perky.
Now, this is what we think about that. We think, man, y'all like Flowers, or y'all like White when you agree with them, but when he challenges you, it's like you can't see it. Like that's how we perceive the whole situation.
Well, I've told you I don't like how White does some others, but I gave my objective critique to both of them, But
props to you. Flowers are cut from the same cloth, like with that comment down there. It don't say that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, but to be honest, I mean, Jeremiah, when it says that this is the work of God that you believe, it doesn't say unconditional election. It doesn't even imply it.
Yeah.
But that's what if you're going to use John 6 as a proof text. But let me say this. Well, you said something there, and then I was going to
I
respond.
get all preachy sometimes. You got to forgive me.
About giving me fits. Well, all I said was the question is difficult. It's always been difficult. There's difficult questions for every theology. I don't think, personally, I didn't think that and it helped you, but I think you did because you played it. And
I'm trying to think what question I thought you gave me fits on. So yeah, like to me, those are, I like to say, fun moments in the debate because I worked really hard on understanding, trying to think of the philosophical question for it. But essentially what's meaningful for libertarian free will is if you're given a command, then you can respond to it, not just in the moral sense, but also in the act itself. It escapes me. So anyway, I sent you a book that I read by Dr. Guillaume Bion, and I can't remember the full title, but it's totally in the world of philosophy. And so I'd prepared a while to kind of set up that question, and I was like,
yeah, that was the that's what I'm going to respond to, something there. But this is something he asked earlier. So I guess Calvin says this: those who infer from this passage, that's verse 29, which we're talking about, that faith is the gift of God are mistaken, for Christ does not show us what God produces in us, but what he wishes and requires from us. Now, you obviously disagree, but he was saying he agrees with Calvin on this. Now, so would you disagree with Calvin on that?
So what was the Calvin quote again?
Those who infer from this passage that faith is the gift of God are mistaken, for Christ does not show us what God produces in us, but what he wishes and requires from us.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I would want to go look at that context because, yeah, I do see this because I'll be the first to say I don't agree with Calvin on a lot of things. In fact,
Me too.
Yeah, you do. But I try to show people, especially Presbyterians, where I disagree with Calvin. But yeah, I think that's interesting. I definitely want to go look up Calvin's commentary on that because to me, this would be like a slam dunk text to say you need the powerful working of God here to bring a dead sinner to newness of life. And I get how everybody says, well, don't say that. And I'm over here saying,
but that's not Calvinistic, though. I mean, well, we all agree with that. The question is that Calvin, or how did you word it? That powerful working of God. What words did you say?
You got it. I was partially quoting Colossians 2:12.
Well, the powerful working of God, but the question is, this powerful working of God, when he does it, is it based upon an unconditional election? And so you guys say that John 6 establishes that. I'm saying, no, that's a presupposition. It's just not a proof text.
And the short response which people have heard us is, I go back to verse 29, which I would say is super clear. And if anyone under the sun were to grant me that effectual gift of believing, then I think you would maybe agree that if we do grant that into verse 44, that's how we would say unconditional election.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I wouldn't grant effectual. I mean,
yeah, exactly. But I'm
irresistible, you know.
Yeah, well,
so verse 29 says, this is the work of God that you believe in him whom he has sent. But it is presupposed by a Calvinist or by yourself that is irresistible.
It's a work of God, right?
Yeah, but God can do works that aren't irresistible if he so chooses.
So, okay. How would God work belief into you that's not irresistible?
Through the gospel.
Okay, so everyone who hears the gospel believes.
Not everyone. That's presupposing universal irresistibility, right?
So that I do.
But you have to remember what I believe. I believe people can choose to reject it.
Right. I do think that's harder for your worldview and systematic to account for that verse, because if we reversed the proposition for you to defend it, I would do very similar things that you're doing now, which is good, but just pressing on the presuppositions and the verbiage. And I'm saying I am drawing that out of the text. Now, someone that disagrees is going to have to say, don't say that. Don't mean that.
Why not? No, see, but what I'm saying is you are assuming all the text says is that it's the work of God that we believe. it doesn't say whether it's irresistible or not. The text does not say that.
Yeah. Well, I would tell people it depends what you mean by irresistible, because
Well, I mean what Calvinists mean.
yeah. Well, then we would say this is a work of God. And we're over here saying it's not also a work of man or cooperation of man. All the text says is it's a work of God. Like, I feel like our side, my side of the screen, is being more consistent with what the text says. Now, we infer different meanings from it. I think that grounds what we're trying to prove, but I recognize that you don't.
All I'm saying is, if it's logically possible, even, let's just forget about what Scripture says otherwise. Even if it's logically possible that God could work something that isn't irresistible. Think about this, Jeremiah.
You've kept me on. You're pretty slick. You're now the slickest man alive. You got me 20 minutes past what I was going to do.
Oh, well, okay. Well, we can end it here pretty shortly. Let me just make this point. In the Old Testament, it says that Solomon's wives turned away his heart from following God. They did something, and in fact, they did it to his heart. It specifically says they turned away his heart to other gods and from following Yahweh. They did something to his heart, but it doesn't say it was irresistible or not. Now, we, of course, realize these are humans. It isn't irresistible. So to do something, and even in this case, to work an effect on somebody's heart, can even be done by people. And since we can see that it isn't irresistible, if his wives are doing it, that means we still say they did it to him, even though he conceded. He allowed them. That's the word you guys always say. Since he gave in, that's the word I would use, not allow. He submitted to their persuasion. And when he does that, it still says they turned away his heart. Just like when it says God works the Spirit in your heart, or God works belief. Yes, but that doesn't mean that he does it irresistible any more than Solomon's wives turned away his heart irresistibly. Now, I'm not saying, I know what's going to be said, oh, you're comparing God to Solomon's wives. No, I'm comparing how language works, Jeremiah. To say that somebody does something,
but not understanding.
To say that somebody does something like somebody's heart or to work something doesn't mean it's irresistible necessarily. That's what I'm comparing.
Yep.
And I think that's a pretty good example, don't you? Because
pretty good.
I mean,
I'll give you half a point. I'll give you half a point for it.
What's that?
I said that's a pretty good point. I'll give you a half point. Look, I got a question for you.
Okay.
What do you think is what do you think the most persuasive point of Calvinism is?
The most persuasive point. I'm going to try to be genuine here and not say nothing.
Thank you.
That's okay. What's the most persuasive point?
And it could be for any of the 5-point acrostic, or it could be for a type of divine determinism. I'm just curious for those on the other side that you think, okay, I can see to a degree, even if it's couched within bad reasoning, how a lot of people find that persuasive. And hopefully it's not a backhanded one.
Well, I'm going to try that it isn't. I would say passages on like Ephesians 1 and to talk about predestination, and the reason I think those are the most persuasive is because, number one, I think Calvinists have done a good job of communicating their message. Now, this isn't trying to be backhanded.
Sure.
They've done a good job for many years, and so it's almost automatic now that when people hear the word, that's what they assume it means. That's why
I want to ask Leighton Flowers the same thing. What's the most persuasive point for Calvinism that people hear, understand, and hopefully it's not backhand? So I just wanted Leighton to maybe post that, so when you're done, we can put his answer on the screen. Go ahead.
Even when non-Calvinists, I often hear them say, well, I don't believe in predestination. You can't say that. You have granted to the Calvinists their meaning of predestination. The Bible uses the word. You can't just say, I don't believe in it. See, so I think most persuasive things is just how do I say it when it's not backhanded?
Like I had to squeeze that in there because I know how these questions go.
Well, I think you get what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. Your big point is Calvinists have done a good job of at least articulating their position.
Well, they've done a good job of
Marketing.
being the loudest voice in the room. Can I say it like that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that's fair.
I think this is a pretty interesting point. Even on Calvinism, faith repentance isn't a miracle. Regeneration is a miracle, and it causes a man to desire to believe, repent freely. So it's not a miracle even on Calvinism. Because you have to have the regeneration in your view first. So it's the regeneration would be the miracle, right? Not the faith.
Yeah, but to me, that's a distinction without a difference because that repentant faith is an effectual gift of regeneration. But I hear you, Dr. Flowers. I still want to hear what you think the most persuasive point of Calvinism is that's kind of floating on the internet from the Johnny Macs. Oh, yeah, okay. He has said this before, and I thought, okay, this is a good point because Dr. Flowers said that he thinks, in his opinion, Romans 9 is easy to explain the context. I'm sure you would feel the same way. And he has said before that Acts 13:48 on the surface definitely seems to fit well within the Calvinistic paradigm. So I appreciate him bringing that back out.
Yeah. Now, so actually, now that he said that, that's really along the same lines as what I was talking about. I was talking about predestination, like Ephesians 1. This is the same language. God, how does it say it? Typically in the King James, what most people, but it says, help me out here. It says, and all those that were, I'm going to have to pull it up. As many as were ordained unto eternal life believed. So yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about. Just simply looking at language like that, and when you understand what Calvinists say, that fits well, which is what I was saying about predestination. You know?
Can I ask another kind of rogue question? Just since it's not every day I talk to you and Dr. Flowers kind of in the same context. Tell me, and I texted you the other day about, kind of what doesn't make Roman Catholics at large saved. So like for you, what counts as being in the kingdom versus in the standard of being saved versus where it's distorted and puts somebody outside the faith? If you want, I'll tell you kind of my quick answer to that just so you can kind of play off of it. Is that okay?
Sure.
And so same question for Dr. Flowers. What's the standard of that you would hold someone to become saved versus someone has distorted that and become lost? So I tell people you got to believe in the right Jesus, and you have to receive the right Jesus the way that he commanded us to. So when I back up, I'm thinking about passages like John 8:24, that unless you believe that ego eimi, then you will die in your sins. That's the incarnate Christ, the God-man, who is also the second person of the triune God. Got to believe in that Jesus, or you have to believe in the direction of that Jesus, not to deny the incarnation and the sovereign triune God. So that's the right Jesus. So that's different than, Unitarians to polytheism and all the rest. And then I'm thinking of John 1, Galatians 1, that you have to receive that Jesus by faith apart from works. And so to me, gospel of grace mentality, and this is kind of how I navigate the waters of saying if someone's in the kingdom or not.
Okay.
So
Well,
how would you answer kind of distinguishing? I know it's always case by case, but what are some good principles that you determine if someone's in the kingdom or outside the kingdom based on what they're saying?
I would say you're out of the kingdom if you don't believe the King James is the no.
Oh, somebody, Michelle, Sherry, KJV out there. No,
I wasn't making a comment towards her. I was.
She's been a supporter of the apologetic dog, so I'm glad she's still in the side chat.
Yeah, no, I was just joking. I was thinking of actually someone like, never mind. But I believe what puts you in the kingdom is when you put your faith in Jesus Christ in an attempt to genuinely submit to him and be his disciple. So it's like Apollos in Acts chapter 18 at the end.
Yep.
It says good things about him, but it says that he only knew the baptism of John. So even something significant as baptism, he didn't have correct. But he wasn't a false teacher.
Right.
he had salvation is not based upon the precision of your knowledge.
Right.
What he did was, what he did know, he faithfully served Jesus in and corrected it when he realized he was wrong. That's, I think, what makes someone saved.
Okay, I don't know. I think all Leighton said was God judges the heart. He will judge rightly. And so I agree with that, but I think we have good biblical grounds for if someone articulates a false gospel, that gospel is to be anathema. So I'm wondering, what are the parameters of judging a true gospel versus a false gospel?
Well, I would say, well, I'll tell you things that I would say, if nothing else, are borderline, but this free grace idea where people say you don't have to submit to Jesus at all and you're still going to be saved. I'm not going to call that the gospel at all. Now, there may be some who call themselves free grace who would say, no, you're not going to fall away. I mean, you're not going to be a rebel. I mean, a true Christian is going to serve Jesus. But I just have no respect for someone who says, no, you don't have to submit to Jesus. And the mid-Acts dispensationalists, to some extent, at least they'll say, well, they'll say you don't have to submit to Jesus in the Gospels or something like that. I think that's terrible. You deny the lordship of Jesus is pretty bad.
So how I would kind of piggyback off what you're saying to some degree, you and I have our disagreements in this question. But when I say someone has to submit to Christ, I'm saying a true faith alone, apart from works. But the free gracer, they mean something else by faith than what I mean, because I'm talking about a repentant faith. And like you and I have talked about, they want to remove repentance. And I'm like, oh, when you do that, that is an empty faith that even James 2, I would argue, brings up. That is a mere said faith that is maybe assenting to facts. But if there's no repentance, if there's no change of mind that engages the heart, then that's not submitting to Christ's kingship. Kind of me and you, where we disagree is how we define faith and how we define works, I think.
But we we would agree on what you just said. Yeah. Repentance is a necessary product of faith.
I think we're saying the same thing, maybe just semantically different, but faith and repentance are two sides of the same coin. I don't think you get genuinely one without the other. And how you explain saving faith has to involve repentance, and how you explain saving repentance is necessarily interwoven with faith.
Yeah. Well, at any rate, I think, so go back to the debate and kind of end it here. I don't believe White's a good debater, no matter, even if he's wrong. I mean, that's the truth. But I think he didn't establish his presuppositions, and I didn't say that in most of my comments because I thought that's expected. Everybody's kind of expecting that.
I hear you loud and clear.
And so I have a debate coming up on some passages, and I just say when you debate a passage, you have to establish that passage proves it, not just could flow with it, not just could harmonize it, but proves it. And I pressed you a little bit. You gave your case, which I think failed, but I would say that, wouldn't I?
That's okay. Dr. Flowers, I love this. He goes, so why isn't there a sola repentance too? That's hilarious. Because he's honestly said, or other times he has said, well, why don't you just say sola works also in y'all's, 5 solas formula? And I appreciate that. But how I would genuinely say is when we say a sola fide, it's embedded that it's a repentant faith apart from works, which is a category of the heart, contrasted with our external acts of obedience. So
why is he asking? Doesn't he hold the solas and all that?
This is where I'm not sure on the provisionist / maybe traditional Baptist. I think it goes back to a marketing thing, like you were rightly saying. Got to point that way. Typically, the Reformed hearken the 5 solas, and so I don't know if you're provisionist / traditional Southern Baptist that you want to be careful to talk about the solas because you may be sounding Reformed and you want to maybe distance yourself from that. That's my guess because I don't know.
Well,
hey, we went over 3 hours. I just want you to know.
Well, it's a large. It's pretty big. A pretty good audience. 48. Of course, if you're a person that gets like hundreds, maybe not. But 47 is pretty good people. People are interested. So I thought it'd be really educational.
The solas are stronger on provisionism. Thank you, Dr. Flowers. By the way, I may re-upload this on my channel. Are you okay with that?
Me? Yeah, I mean, it's fine with me.
I might make it a two-parter though. I got to think of a banger thumbnail to make with us.
So next is for me to get David Lewis, since he said he's coming on. I'm going to get him on. But anyway, yeah. So I appreciate everybody in the audience. I found the debate everybody was anticipating this, and everybody's been talking about it. So I thought, well, I guess I'll talk about it too. I have some thoughts on it, and I appreciate Dr. Flowers, since we're ultimately talking about him. He come in and have a conversation too.
I was a little starstruck and distracted with Dr. Flowers in the side chat.
So I thought you guys were like big buds and you knew each other.
No, I'm a nobody. AK.
No, I mean you got nobody's a nobody. That's what I always say. Nobody's a nobody.
I'm trying to get people to looking at that beard. That's why I got to have a beard on the apologetic dog. That pit bull.
Yeah. Well, all right. I'll let you. You got some final comments? What you want to say before we close it up?
Yeah, just to kind of echo a little bit of what you said. I appreciate everybody in the side chat. I really appreciate you, AK. Just so you know, you're in my prayers, and I really do appreciate our conversation. Something I respect about you, critical thinker, and I really think you want to steel man the person you're engaging with, like me. And so I want to be one of the first people to say, AK, I have a lot of respect for you, distinguished from other crowds where they're kind of saying the same old, stringing the one string banjo. And so you've kind of shown me that you take the scripture seriously. And so to me, that's good. And that's why I agreed to come on here because I knew it'd be a charitable discussion. I don't want to engage in any condescending way. We have our disagreements. I think we could both be staring at the same verse and we're like, man, it's so clear on what it is saying and what it's not saying. And that's okay. I think me and you hopefully charitably modeled that. And so I'm wanting people to take that away of saying, man, AK really steamrolled Jeremiah. But you know what? Jeremiah was able to really have a charitable dialogue in that. And for people on my side that maybe think, man, AK just could not understand what Jeremiah was saying. It's like, hey, let's remember that Christ-like love when we are engaging with people, whether it be evangelistic or in an iron sharpening iron context. So if you enjoyed some of our interaction, even if you disagree with me, please flow over to the Apologetic Dog YouTube channel. I really plan on pumping out more content over there, and I got a website that's about to be released along with a lot of other projects. So I appreciate your support in those ways. Oh, and I have a debate the same day that AK does, April 5th. Don't know what he said earlier, but I'm going to encourage you to watch that either at 12-5 Church, where I serve as one of the pastors and elders at. It'll be live and in person, April 5th at 6 p.m. Admission is free. So if you're in the Northeast Arkansas area, come check it out. Or if you like to travel and check out those kind of things, mark that in your calendars. Or if you're committed to Team AK, at least be looking forward to my debate. Maybe watch the recording of it. So that's about all I got.
Well, I appreciate all that. I appreciate you coming on, and yeah, we have friendly discussion. Now, I will say, I said that I like meeting the man. If I'm talking to Matt Slick, I go pretty hard, and if I think there's a lot on the line, I will go pretty hard. And I don't think that's unfriendly. I think there can be unkindness, but you and I are very friendly. So I don't just sit there and try to press you and try to hammer you in the ground. And I know some people say, "Are you going to go at him harder?" Well, in some cases you do that with the person. The situation calls for it, but that's just the way it is. But you're always smiling. It's hard to really hammer you. I mean,
people even get mad at me for that. They're like, he's smiling, trying to distract you. And I'm like, I promise, I'm just being me. And before I debate, before I do anything, I pray that God would protect me from pride, that I would show the love of Christ. So I try to have a good time. I think that's what helps me stay clear in the debate is I care about the person I'm debating with. I've been praying for weeks, months leading up to it. and I want to have a good time. Like, I'll tell you this, AK, I want to be able to one day, you may appreciate this one day. I want to debate professors on their home turf at their own universities on the existence of God. And so I want to be able to do that where even an atheist professor that hates what I stand for thinks, you know what? I like him though. That was fun. That was charitable. We'll do it again. So that's my prayer, is just to show the love of Christ in these contexts.
All right. Well, all right, everybody. Good audience. I didn't get a lot of your questions in. I mean, I didn't really actually see a lot of people saying at AK or at Jeremiah. I did look for them, but I got some of them in. Appreciate everybody. Appreciate the discussion with Jeremiah, and hope you guys were educated. Good night and God bless.